there is a library that saved Western civilization, not through a single dramatic act of heroism, not through a moment of brilliance that makes for a compelling film scene, but through a slow, patient, century after century process of copying, storing, cataloguing, and preserving the written heritage of the ancient world while the rest of Europe forgot how to read. For over 1,000 years, this library was the last unbroken thread connecting the modern world to the intellectual achievements of ancient Greece and Rome. Without it, the Renaissance could not have happened. Without it, the recovery of Aristotle, of Plato, of Euclid, of Ptolemy, of Hippocrates, of Galen, and of hundreds of other ancient authors would have been impossible or severely diminished. Without it, the intellectual foundations of modern science, philosophy, law, and literature would be thinner, weaker, and more fragmented than they are. That library was the Imperial Library of Constantinople. It stood in the heart of the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the eastern half of the Roman Empire that survived the fall of the West by nearly 1,000 years. It was not one building but a complex system, a network of imperial, patriarchal, monastic, and private collections that together constituted the single most important and most comprehensive repository of Greek language knowledge on Earth. At various points in its long history, the imperial collection alone held an estimated 120,000 volumes, a number that does not include the vast holdings of the monasteries, the patriarchal library, the university library, and the private collections of the Byzantine aristocracy, and it is almost entirely gone. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks on May 29, 1453, is one of the most consequential dates in human history. When the walls were breached and the city fell after a siege of nearly 2 months, the soldiers who poured through the gaps were not primarily interested in books. They were interested in plunder, in gold, in silver, in silk, in slaves. The manuscripts that filled the libraries of the city were, to most of the soldiers, worthless. They could not read Greek. They had no use for philosophical treatises, or mathematical proofs, or epic poems, in a language they did not understand. And so the manuscripts were, in many cases, destroyed, discarded, or used for purposes that had nothing to do with their intellectual content. Bindings were stripped for their leather. Pages were used as kindling. Illuminated manuscripts were valued for their gold leaf and discarded once the gold had been scraped away. But the loss of Constantinople's libraries did not begin in 1453. It began centuries earlier, in a series of catastrophes that progressively diminished the collections long before the Ottomans arrived. Fire was the most persistent enemy. The Imperial Library was destroyed by fire at least 3 times in its history, each time requiring decades of effort to rebuild. The Fourth Crusade, launched by Western Christians in 1202 and diverted to Constantinople in 1204, resulted in the sacking of the city by the very armies that were supposed to be fighting Muslims in the Holy Land. The Crusaders looted Constantinople with a thoroughness and a savagery that shocked even their contemporaries. They stripped churches of their treasures, melted down bronze statues for coin, and destroyed or scattered manuscripts by the thousands. The Byzantine scholar Nicetas Choniates, who witnessed the sack, described it as a catastrophe without parallel, worse than anything the city had suffered in its nearly 900-year history. The cumulative effect of these disasters was devastating. By the time the Ottomans arrived in 1453, the Imperial Library was already a shadow of its former self, diminished by centuries of fire, war, and political turmoil. But it still contained irreplaceable texts. It still held manuscripts that existed nowhere else in the world. And the fall of the city scattered what remained across Europe, the Islamic world, and the dustbin of history in proportions that scholars are still trying to determine. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand what the Imperial Library of Constantinople actually contained, how it preserved the intellectual heritage of the ancient world through a millennium of upheaval, and why its progressive destruction represents one of the most significant and least understood losses in the history of human knowledge. You are going to learn about specific texts that were saved, specific texts that were lost, and the specific catastrophes that determined which was which. you are going to see how the survival of virtually every ancient Greek text we possess today depended, at some critical point, on a manuscript that passed through Constantinople. And you are going to confront the unsettling truth that our entire understanding of classical antiquity is shaped by the accidents, the fires, the wars, and the political decisions that determined which manuscripts survived the long centuries in the Byzantine capital and which did not. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. This is not a story about a single moment of destruction. It is a story about the slow erosion of memory, about the 1,000 small losses that add up to an irreversible catastrophe, about the fragility of the thread that connects the present to the past. The Imperial Library of Constantinople held that thread for 1,000 years. It held that thread through fires that consumed hundreds of thousands of volumes. It held that thread through invasions by armies that could not read the texts they destroyed. It held that thread through civil wars, religious controversies, and the slow economic decline of an empire that was shrinking century by century under pressure from enemies on every frontier. And when it finally snapped, the consequences echoed through every library, every university, and every classroom in the Western world. Now, let us begin. To understand the Imperial Library of Constantinople, we must first understand the world that created it. The library did not appear out of nothing. It was the product of a civilization that placed an extraordinary value on the written word, a civilization that understood, with a clarity born of long experience, that knowledge recorded on parchment could outlast the empires that produced it, the languages in which it was written, and the people who first read it. The Byzantine Empire was the most literate, the most bureaucratic, and the most textually sophisticated state in the medieval world, and its library system reflected that sophistication at every level. The story begins with the founding of Constantinople itself. In 330 of the Common Era, the Roman Emperor Constantine I established a new capital for the Roman Empire on the site of the ancient Greek colony of Byzantium, at the strategically vital point where Europe meets Asia across the narrow strait of the Bosporus. The city was designed from the beginning to be a second Rome, a capital worthy of an empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia. Constantine invested enormous resources in its construction, importing marble, statues, and artistic treasures from across the Roman world. He built forums, palaces, baths, a hippodrome, churches, and civic buildings on a scale that rivaled or exceeded anything in Rome itself. Among the institutions that Constantine established in his new capital was a library. The details of its founding are somewhat obscure, but the Emperor Constantius II, Constantine's son, is credited with establishing the Imperial Library on a more formal basis around 357 of the Common Era. He appointed a staff of scribes, 4 Greek and 3 Latin, whose task was to copy and repair manuscripts for the imperial collection. This was a modest beginning by the standards of the great ancient libraries, but it established a principle that would guide Byzantine intellectual life for the next 11 centuries. The preservation of written knowledge was a state responsibility, funded by the imperial treasury and carried out by professional scribes under imperial authority. The significance of this institutional commitment cannot be overstated. In the Western Roman Empire, which was collapsing under the pressure of Germanic invasions during the 5th century, there was no comparable state-sponsored program of manuscript preservation. Western libraries, both public and private, were being destroyed or abandoned as the administrative infrastructure of the Roman state disintegrated. The great libraries of Rome itself, including the Bibliotheca Ulpia and the various libraries attached to the imperial baths, fell into disuse and eventually disappeared. In Gaul, in Spain, in Britain, in North Africa, the Roman library system ceased to function. The preservation of classical texts in the West fell, almost by default, to the Christian monasteries, which maintained scriptoria and small libraries primarily for religious purposes, but incidentally preserved some classical texts as well. In the East, by contrast, the Byzantine state maintained a continuous commitment to the preservation of classical learning. The reasons for this were partly practical and partly cultural. Practically, The Byzantine government needed educated administrators, lawyers, diplomats, and military officers, and the education of these officials required access to classical texts on rhetoric, philosophy, law, history, and military science. Culturally, the Byzantine elite identified themselves as the direct heirs of classical Greek civilization, and they regarded the preservation of Greek learning as both a cultural obligation and a source of political legitimacy. To be Roman, in the Byzantine sense, was to be part of a continuous civilization that stretched back through the Roman Empire to the classical Greeks, and the written texts of that civilization were the tangible evidence of that continuity. This cultural identity was not merely a matter of abstract pride. It had practical consequences for the way the Byzantines treated their literary heritage. The Byzantine educational system, from the elementary schools that taught basic literacy to the advanced schools that trained theologians, philosophers, and civil servants, was built around the study of classical Greek texts. Every educated Byzantine was expected to be familiar with Homer, with the major works of Plato and Aristotle, with the speeches of the Attic orators, and with the histories of Herodotus and Thucydides. This familiarity was not merely desirable, it was essential for professional advancement. A Byzantine bureaucrat who could not compose a formal document in classicizing Greek prose, peppered with allusions to Homer and laced with the rhetorical figures taught by Demosthenes, was not a fully competent bureaucrat. A Byzantine theologian who could not engage with the philosophical vocabulary of Aristotle was not a fully competent theologian. The result was a society that maintained an active and vital connection to the literary heritage of the ancient world for over 1,000 years. This connection was not nostalgic or antiquarian. It was functional. The Byzantines used classical texts as living tools, as models for their own literary production, as sources for their own philosophical and theological arguments, as guides for their own political and military decision-making. The texts were not museum pieces, locked behind glass and admired from a distance. They were working documents, read, annotated, debated, and applied to the problems of the present. This living engagement with the classical past was the engine that drove the copying and preservation of manuscripts in Constantinople's libraries. Texts were preserved because they were actively and regularly used, and they were used because the Byzantine educational and cultural system demanded it. The scale of the Byzantine literary heritage was enormous. The Greek literary tradition, from Homer in the 8th century before the Common Era to the writers of late antiquity in the 6th century of the Common Era, encompassed roughly 1,400 years of continuous literary production. It included epic poetry, lyric poetry, drama, history, philosophy, science, mathematics, medicine, rhetoric, law, theology, and dozens of other genres and disciplines. The total volume of Greek literary production over this period was vast, running to millions of individual works if one includes letters, documents, inscriptions, and other non-literary texts alongside the major literary and scientific works. By the time of Constantinople's founding, much of this literary heritage had already been lost. The great ancient libraries at Alexandria and Pergamum had been damaged or destroyed. The Roman library system was in decline. The transition from the papyrus scroll to the parchment codex, which occurred gradually during the first 4 centuries of the Common Era, had created a bottleneck in transmission. Only those texts that were considered worth copying from the old scroll format into the new codex format were preserved. Texts that were not copied during this transition were effectively abandoned, left to deteriorate on their scrolls until they crumbled into illegibility. The scroll to codex transition is one of the most important and least understood events in the history of knowledge preservation. The codex, the bound book of folded pages that we still use today, was a superior format in almost every respect. It was more compact than the scroll. It could hold more text per unit of volume. It was easier to navigate, since a reader could flip to a specific page rather than unrolling an entire scroll to find a particular passage. It was sturdier, since the binding protected the pages from the wear and tear that afflicted the exposed surfaces of a scroll, and it could be written on both sides of each page, unlike papyrus scrolls, which were typically written on only one side. The adoption of the Codex was rapid and decisive. By the 4th century of the Common Era, the Codex had almost completely replaced the scroll for literary texts in the Roman world. The early Christians played a significant role in the adoption of the Codex. Christian communities adopted the Codex format for their scriptures very early, possibly as early as the 2nd century of the Common Era, at a time when pagan literary culture still favored the scroll. The reasons for this early adoption are debated. Some scholars suggest that the Codex was preferred because it was more practical for liturgical use, since a priest needed to find specific passages quickly during services. Others suggest that the Codex format was adopted as a deliberate marker of Christian identity, distinguishing Christian books from pagan scrolls. Whatever the reason, the association of the Codex with Christianity gave the new format a powerful institutional patron, and the growing influence of Christianity in the Roman world accelerated the Codex's adoption for all types of literature. But the transition came at a cost. Copying a text from a scroll into a codex required the same investment of time, materials, and skilled labor as any other act of copying. A scribe had to read the scroll, transcribe its contents onto parchment pages, and bind those pages into a codex. This was expensive, parchment was costly, scribal labor was limited, and the decision about which text to copy was made by individuals, by librarians, by teachers, by scholars, by monks, and by patrons whose priorities and interests determined what was preserved and what was lost. Texts that were widely read and frequently used, like Homer, Plato, Aristotle, the Bible, and the works of the Church Fathers, were copied many times and survived in many manuscripts. Texts that were obscure, specialized, controversial, or simply out of fashion were less likely to be copied and more likely to disappear when their scrolls finally deteriorated beyond recovery. The Imperial Library of Constantinople was, in this context, the single most important institution for determining which ancient Greek texts survived the scroll-to-codex transition and the subsequent centuries of medieval transmission. The library's scribes copied texts. The library's patrons funded the production of new manuscripts. The library's scholars selected which texts were worth preserving and which were of lesser priority. The library's physical infrastructure protected the resulting codices from fire, moisture, insects, and the other environmental threats that destroy organic materials over time. For over 1,000 years, the Imperial Library performed this function with a consistency and a dedication that no other institution in the medieval world could match. The library was also a centre of textual scholarship. Byzantine scholars did not merely copy texts passively. They compared different copies of the same text, identified discrepancies, corrected errors, and produced critical editions that attempted to reconstruct the original author's words as accurately as possible. This scholarly tradition, which had its roots in the textual criticism practiced at the ancient libraries of Alexandria and Pergamum, was continued and refined by Byzantine scholars over the centuries. The Byzantine copies of ancient texts are, in many cases, the products of careful editorial work, reflecting the judgments and corrections of generations of scholars who devoted their careers to the maintenance and improvement of the textual tradition. Without this editorial work, the text we possess today would be significantly more corrupt, more error-laden, and less reliable than they are. The physical scale of the Byzantine library system was substantial. The imperial collection, at its peak, held an estimated 120,000 volumes. The Patriarchal Library of the Ecumenical Patriarch, the head of the Orthodox Church, held a separate and significant collection of religious and theological texts. The monasteries of Constantinople and its surroundings, including the great monastic communities of Mount Athos in northern Greece, maintained their own libraries, some of them containing thousands of manuscripts. The University of Constantinople, founded or refounded at various points in Byzantine history, maintained its own academic library, and the private collections of wealthy Byzantine aristocrats, scholars, and officials added still more volumes to the city's total holdings. The aggregate number of manuscripts held in Constantinople at any given point in its history is impossible to determine with precision, but it was certainly in the hundreds of thousands. No other city in the medieval Christian world came close. The largest Western European library, before the 12th century, was probably the Papal Library in Rome, which held perhaps a few thousand volumes. The great monastic libraries of Western Europe, at Bobbio, Monte Cassino, Reichenau, and St. Gall, held collections that ranged from a few hundred to perhaps 2,000 volumes each. The difference between the Byzantine and Western European literary worlds was not merely quantitative. It was qualitative. A scholar in Constantinople had access to a breadth and depth of classical Greek learning that was simply unimaginable to a scholar in Paris, in London, or in Rome during the same period. The Western scholar might possess a few works of Aristotle, translated into Latin, along with some selections from the Latin classics and the Church Fathers. The Byzantine scholar could read Plato, Aristotle, Homer, the complete works of the Attic orators, the major Greek historians, the scientific texts of Euclid, Ptolemy, and Archimedes, and a vast body of theological, philosophical, and literary commentary, all in the original Greek. The largest Islamic libraries, in Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo, were comparable to or larger than Constantinople's in certain periods, but they were independent systems with their own channels of transmission and preservation. Focused primarily on Arabic language texts, Constantinople was unique in the medieval world as the single largest repository of Greek language classical texts. It was the bottleneck through which the entire Greek literary heritage of the ancient world had to pass in order to survive into the modern era. This concentration of texts in a single city was both the library's greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability. Its strength was that it allowed for the maintenance of a critical mass of scholarly activity, a community of readers, scribes, and scholars who could use, copy, and transmit the texts in the collection. Its vulnerability was that any catastrophe that struck the city, fire, earthquake, siege, or sack, threatened the entire collection simultaneously. The Byzantine scribes, who copied the manuscripts in the Imperial Library and its associated institutions, developed techniques that were, in many ways, the most sophisticated in the medieval world. Byzantine scribes were trained professionals who worked in organized scriptoria under the supervision of experienced librarians and scholars. They used a distinctive script called minuscule, which replaced the earlier majuscule or uncial script in the 9th century. The transition from majuscule to minuscule was itself a significant event in the history of knowledge preservation, comparable in some ways to the earlier transition from scroll to codex. Minuscule script was smaller, more compact, and faster to write than majuscule, which meant that more text could be fitted onto a single page and that scribes could produce manuscripts more quickly. This increased efficiency made it economically feasible to copy a larger number of texts, which in turn increased the survival rate for ancient literature. The transition from majuscule to minuscule script, which occurred primarily during the 9th and 10th centuries, was another bottleneck in the transmission of ancient texts. Just as texts that were not copied from scroll to codex were likely to be lost, texts that were not copied from majuscule to minuscule were at high risk of disappearing. The older majuscule manuscripts continued to deteriorate, and once they became too damaged to read, the texts they contained were gone unless a minuscule copy had been made. The period from roughly 850 to 1000 of the Common Era was therefore a critical window for the survival of ancient Greek literature. The texts that were copied into minuscule during this period had a good chance of surviving to the present day. The texts that were not copied during this period were, in most cases, lost forever. The 9th century Renaissance in Byzantine intellectual life, which coincided with the majuscule to minuscule transition, was one of the most important periods in the history of knowledge preservation. During this period, a group of remarkable scholars, working under imperial patronage and within the institutional framework of the patriarchal church and the university, undertook a systematic effort to recover, copy, and organize the classical texts available in the Imperial Library and other Constantinople collections. This effort was driven partly by educational needs, partly by intellectual curiosity, and partly by a conscious awareness that the texts of the ancient world were in danger of being lost if they were not transferred to the new, more practical script. The scholars who oversaw this copying process exercised enormous influence over what survived. The Patriarch Photius, one of the most learned men of the 9th century, compiled a work called the Bibliotheca, also known as the Myriabiblon, which contains summaries and critical assessments of 279 books that Photius had read. Many of the works described in the Bibliotheca are now lost, and Photius's summaries are, in some cases, the only surviving evidence that those works ever existed. The Bibliotheca is therefore both a catalogue of Byzantine reading and a record of loss, a document that simultaneously reveals the richness of the library to which Photius had access and the poverty of what has survived to our own time. Photius's reading ranged across an extraordinary breadth of genres and periods. He read historians, orators, novelists, theologians, hagiographers, medical writers, and natural philosophers. He read works from the classical period, the Hellenistic period, late antiquity, and the early Byzantine era. His summaries vary in length and detail, from brief notes of a few sentences to extended analyses that fill several pages. In many cases, the Bibliotheca provides the only surviving account of a work's contents, structure, and quality. When Photius describes a lost historical work, his summary becomes the primary source for our knowledge of the events that work described. When he evaluates a lost literary text, his judgment becomes the only evidence we have of that text's merit. The Bibliotheca is, in effect, a map of the library, a guide to a collection that no longer exists, drawn by a reader who did not know that the collection would one day be destroyed. The encyclopedic projects of the 10th century, undertaken under the patronage of the Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenetos, who reigned from 913 to 959, represent another crucial phase in the survival of ancient knowledge. Constantine was a scholar emperor, a man whose intellectual interests ranged from history and diplomacy to agriculture and court ceremony. He commissioned a series of massive compilations that extracted and organized information from earlier sources on subjects including agriculture, diplomacy, military strategy, court ceremonial, and the administration of the empire. These compilations, known collectively as the Constantinian excerpts, preserved passages from dozens of ancient historians and other writers whose original works have since been lost. The excerpts are, in many cases, the only surviving fragments of these lost works, and they owe their existence to the specific intellectual priorities of a single 10th century emperor. The sheer scale of the Constantinian project was remarkable. The excerpts on history alone, organized into 53 thematic categories, filled hundreds of pages and drew on the works of more than 24 ancient and Byzantine historians. For many of these historians, Constantinian excerpts are the only surviving trace of their work. The historian Menander Protector, who wrote an account of Byzantine diplomacy in the 6th century, survives almost entirely through the Constantinian excerpts. The historian Priscus of Panium, who left a famous eyewitness account of the court of Attila the Hun, survives primarily through excerpts preserved in later Byzantine compilations that drew on the Constantinian tradition. Without the deliberate effort of a 10th century emperor to extract and preserve these passages, our knowledge of entire periods and events of ancient and early medieval history would be even more fragmentary than it already is. The Byzantine educational system reinforced the library's role in preserving classical learning. Education in Byzantium was structured around the study of classical Greek texts, particularly Homer, the Attic orators, the historians, and the philosophers. Students were expected to read, memorize, and imitate classical models of Greek prose and poetry. This educational emphasis created a continuous demand for copies of the classical texts, which in turn sustained the scriptoria that produced the manuscripts and the libraries that stored them. The survival of a classical text depended, in many cases, on its usefulness in the educational system. Texts that were regularly assigned in schools were copied frequently and survived in many manuscripts. Texts that fell out of the educational canon were copied less often and were more vulnerable to loss. The structure of Byzantine education was remarkably stable over the centuries. The system was built on the study of grammar, rhetoric, and philosophy, the three pillars of classical Greek education that had been formalized in the Hellenistic period and transmitted through the Roman period into the Byzantine era. Grammar, in the Byzantine context, meant not merely the study of linguistic rules, but the close reading and analysis of classical literary texts. Students began by reading Homer, typically the Iliad, and progressed through a carefully graded sequence of increasingly difficult texts. Rhetoric involved the study of the Attic orators, particularly Demosthenes, Isocrates, and Lysias, and the practice of composing speeches in imitation of classical models. Philosophy encompassed the study of Plato and Aristotle, along with their commentators and later philosophical traditions. This curriculum was conservative in the most literal sense. It conserved the texts that it used. The works of Homer, the orators, and the major philosophers were copied thousands of times over the centuries because they were needed for educational purposes. A monastery that ran a school needed copies of Homer. A patriarch who wanted to train new theologians needed copies of Aristotle's logical works. An emperor who wanted to educate his bureaucrats needed copies of the historians and the rhetorical handbooks. The demand was continuous, and it ensured the survival of the texts that met it. But this educational filtering process was powerful and in many ways arbitrary. It preserved Homer almost completely, because Homer was the foundation of the Greek educational curriculum and was read by every educated Byzantine. It preserved the works of the great Attic orators, because oratory was a central component of Byzantine education and political life. It preserved the major works of Plato and Aristotle, because philosophy was valued both for its own sake and for its utility in theological debate. But it did not preserve everything equally. Works that were considered obscure, outdated, or theologically problematic were at a disadvantage. Scientific and mathematical texts, which required specialized training to read and were not part of the standard educational curriculum, survived at lower rates than literary and philosophical texts. Technical manuals, practical handbooks, and specialized treatises were even more vulnerable. The result was a selection process that was simultaneously conservative and destructive. It conserved a core canon of classical Greek literature, the works that were most widely read and most deeply embedded in the educational and cultural life of the Byzantine state. But it progressively abandoned texts that fell outside that core, allowing them to deteriorate and disappear through a process of benign neglect rather than active destruction. The Imperial Library of Constantinople did not burn its unwanted books. It simply stopped copying them. And over the course of 1,000 years, the books that stopped being copied ceased to exist. The Byzantine library system also played a crucial role in the transmission of scientific knowledge to the Islamic world, and through the Islamic world, back to Western Europe. The Great Translation movement of the 9th and 10th centuries, centered in Baghdad, drew heavily on Greek scientific and philosophical texts that were obtained from Byzantine sources. Arab scholars and their Syriac Christian intermediaries translated hundreds of Greek texts into Arabic, including works by Aristotle, Plato, Galen, Hippocrates, Euclid, Ptolemy, Archimedes, and many others. These Arabic translations, produced from Greek manuscripts that were in many cases obtained directly or indirectly from Constantinople, became the basis for the flowering of Islamic science and philosophy during the medieval period. When Western European scholars began to recover Greek learning in the 12th and 13th centuries, they often did so through Arabic intermediaries, translating Arabic versions of Greek texts into Latin, a process that involved 2 layers of translation and inevitably introduced distortions and losses. The channels through which Greek manuscripts reached the Arab translators were varied and not always well documented. Some manuscripts were obtained through diplomatic exchanges between the Byzantine and Abbasid courts. The Caliph al-Ma'mun, who founded the House of Wisdom in Baghdad in the early 9th century, reportedly sent emissaries to Constantinople to request copies of Greek scientific texts, and the Byzantine Emperor Theophilos granted his request, providing manuscripts that became the basis for some of the most important Arabic translations. Other manuscripts were obtained through trade, through the collections of Greek-speaking Christian communities in the Near East, or through the surviving libraries of cities like Antioch, Edessa, and Haran that had maintained Greek scholarly traditions through the early Islamic period. The Arabic translation movement was, in effect, a backup system for the Greek intellectual tradition. By translating Greek texts into a new language and distributing copies across the vast geography of the Islamic world, from Spain to Central Asia, the Arab translators created a parallel stream of transmission that was independent of the Byzantine manuscript tradition. When a Greek text was lost in Constantinople, it sometimes survived in Arabic translation, preserved in the libraries of Baghdad, Cairo, Cordoba, or Samarkand. The Arabic tradition was not a complete mirror of the Greek tradition. The Arab translators were selective, focusing primarily on scientific, medical, and philosophical texts, and largely ignoring literary, poetic, and historical works. But for the categories of Greek knowledge that they did translate, the Arabic tradition provided a safety net that proved invaluable. The irony of this transmission history is striking. Greek texts, written in the language of the Byzantine Empire, were translated into Arabic by scholars in Baghdad, then translated from Arabic into Latin by scholars in Toledo and other European centers of translation. The text traveled from Greek to Arabic to Latin, crossing linguistic and cultural boundaries multiple times, each crossing introducing the possibility of error, omission, or misinterpretation. Meanwhile, the original Greek texts remained in Constantinople, available to anyone who could read Greek, but largely inaccessible to Western European scholars who had lost the ability to read that language. The Western recovery of Greek learning was, for centuries, a second-hand process, conducted through translations of translations, while the primary sources sat in libraries that the West could not or would not access. This situation began to change in the 15th century, as Byzantine scholars started traveling to Italy in increasing numbers, bringing with them Greek manuscripts and the linguistic expertise to read them. But the centuries during which Western Europe had to rely on Arabic intermediaries for access to Greek knowledge left a lasting mark on the intellectual history of the West. The Latin translations of Arabic translations of Greek texts were not identical to the Greek originals. They contained errors introduced at each stage of translation. They reflected the interpretive choices of the Arab translators, who sometimes added their own commentary or modified the text to align with Islamic philosophical or theological perspectives, and they omitted passages or entire works that the Arab translators had chosen not to translate. The Western Europe that received Greek learning through the Arabic Channel received a different version of that learning from the one that was available in Constantinople, and the differences between the two versions contributed to the distinctive intellectual trajectory that Western European thought followed during the later medieval period. But what scientists and historians discovered over the following centuries was worse than anyone expected: the apparent security of the Constantinople collections. Their vast scale, their institutional support, their millennium of continuous operation concealed a fundamental vulnerability that would prove devastating. The library was not a monolithic institution, sealed and protected behind impregnable walls and immune to external threats. It was a living system, embedded in the political, economic, and social fabric of the city, subject to the same forces of disruption that affected every other institution in the Byzantine state. The library was repeatedly struck by catastrophes that reduced its holdings, and each catastrophe left the surviving collection smaller, more fragile, and more concentrated in a single city that was itself increasingly threatened by military enemies on every side. The Imperial Library of Constantinople did not die once. It died many times, each death a catastrophe, each recovery a testament to the stubborn determination of Byzantine scholars and emperors to preserve what remained. The story of the library is not a story of a single dramatic destruction, but a story of repeated wounds, each one deeper than the last, each one leaving the collection weaker and more vulnerable to the next blow. It is a death by 1,000 cuts spread over 1,000 years. The first recorded catastrophe struck in 473 of the Common Era, barely a century after the library's formal establishment. A massive fire swept through Constantinople, destroying what ancient sources describe as 120,000 volumes. The number may be exaggerated, as ancient and medieval estimates of book losses often are, but the destruction was clearly severe. A century of collecting, copying, and organizing was undone in a single night. The fire consumed not only the books, but also the physical infrastructure of the library, the buildings, the shelving, the catalogues, the administrative records that gave the collection its organizational coherence. Rebuilding the library meant not only acquiring new copies of the lost texts, but also reconstructing the institutional framework that made those texts accessible and useful. The Emperor Zeno, who ruled from 474 to 491, and his successors undertook the task of rebuilding. Scribes were commissioned to copy texts from other libraries, from monasteries, from private collections, and from whatever sources could be found within the empire and beyond. The rebuilding was slow and expensive, constrained by the limited availability of skilled scribes, the cost of parchment, and the competing demands on the imperial treasury. But it was done. Within a few generations, the imperial collection had been restored to a substantial size, though it is impossible to know whether all of the texts lost in the fire of 473 were successfully recovered. Some were certainly not recovered. A text that existed in only one copy in the imperial library, and that had not been copied elsewhere before the fire, was gone forever. The fire did not discriminate between common texts and rare ones, between frequently copied works and unique manuscripts. It consumed everything equally. The texts that were most likely to be recovered after the fire were the texts that had been most widely copied before it, the canonical works of Greek literature and philosophy that existed in multiple copies across the empire. The texts that were least likely to be recovered were the rare and obscure works that had existed in only one or a few copies, precisely the works that were most in need of institutional protection. This pattern would repeat itself throughout the library's history. Each catastrophe destroyed common and rare texts alike. Each recovery effort succeeded primarily in replacing the common texts, the ones that could be found in other collections, the rare texts, the unique manuscripts, the works that existed in only one or two copies, were progressively winnowed out, their numbers reduced with each cycle of destruction and recovery. The library's collection became, over time, more and more homogeneous, more and more dominated by the canonical texts that were always replaceable and less likely to contain the rare and unique texts that were the most valuable and the most vulnerable. This process of progressive homogenization is one of the least understood but most consequential dynamics in the history of knowledge preservation. It means that the library's losses were not random. They were systematically biased against the rare and the unusual. After each fire, the library had fewer unique texts, fewer specialized treatises, fewer minor works, and a higher proportion of standard canonical texts. The process was cumulative and irreversible. Each round of destruction and replacement moved the collection further from the diverse, comprehensive collection that the early emperors had assembled, and closer to a standardized collection of the most commonly available texts. The library became less valuable with each cycle, not because it held fewer books, since the recovery efforts often restored the collection to its previous size, but because the books it held were increasingly likely to be the same books that existed in many other copies elsewhere, rather than unique texts that existed nowhere else. The second major fire struck in 726 of the Common Era, during the early years of the iconoclast controversy, the bitter theological dispute over the use of religious images that tore the Byzantine Empire apart for over a century. According to some sources, the Emperor Leo III, the initiator of the iconoclast policy, ordered the destruction of the Imperial Library and its associated school, reportedly burning the building with its scholars locked inside. This account is disputed by modern historians, some of whom regard it as anti-iconoclast propaganda rather than a description of actual events. But even the most skeptical scholars acknowledge that the iconoclast period was damaging to Byzantine intellectual life. The destruction of religious images, which was the central policy of the iconoclast emperors, was accompanied by a broader hostility towards certain forms of classical and religious learning, and the institutions that supported that learning suffered accordingly. Whether the fire of 726 was a deliberate act of imperial arson or an accidental conflagration, its consequences were severe. The library's holdings were again reduced, and the rebuilding process again required decades of effort. The period from the mid-8th to the mid-9th century was a relatively dark age for Byzantine literary culture, a time when the production and copying of manuscripts slowed significantly, and the availability of classical texts was more limited than it had been in earlier centuries or would be in later ones. The scholars who emerged from this period, particularly the great 9th century figures like the patriarch Photius and the mathematician Leo the mathematician, found themselves working in an environment where many texts that had been available to earlier generations were no longer accessible, and it gets worse. The most devastating blow to Byzantine intellectual culture before the Ottoman conquest came not from fire or internal politics, but from the armies of Western Christendom. The Fourth Crusade, originally intended as a military expedition to recapture Jerusalem from Muslim control, was diverted to Constantinople through a complex web of Venetian commercial interests, dynastic politics, and the moral bankruptcy of the Crusades' leadership. On April 13th, 1204, the Crusaders breached the walls of Constantinople and sacked the city with a ferocity that beggars description. The historian Stephen Runciman, one of the foremost modern scholars of the Crusades, called the Fourth Crusade the greatest crime against humanity committed during the medieval period. This is not hyperbole. The Crusaders, who were supposedly fellow Christians bound by shared faith and shared cultural heritage, destroyed or damaged virtually every major institution in Constantinople. They looted the churches, stripping them of gold, silver, jewels, and holy relics. They desecrated the altars. They destroyed statues and works of art that had survived for nearly 900 years. They killed civilians, violated women, and sold the inhabitants into slavery. The libraries suffered terribly. The Crusaders had no use for Greek manuscripts and no understanding of their value. Books were burned, torn apart for their bindings, or simply discarded in the streets. Some manuscripts were carried off as loot, ending up in the libraries of Western European monasteries and cathedrals, where they were sometimes preserved but more often neglected, since the Western scholars who received them could not, in many cases, read Greek. The actual number of manuscripts destroyed during the sack of 1204 is impossible to determine, but the devastation to Constantinople's literary culture was clearly enormous. The sack lasted 3 days, during which the Crusaders subjected the city to systematic looting on a scale that had no precedent in the history of Christian Europe. They broke into churches, private homes, palaces, and public buildings, taking everything of value and destroying much of what they could not carry. The fire that accompanied the sack, set by the Crusaders themselves to cover their movements and flush out resistance, destroyed entire neighborhoods. Ancient buildings that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. Libraries and archives were consumed by flame or buried under collapsing masonry. The destruction was not the surgical removal of specific items of value. It was the wholesale demolition of a city's cultural infrastructure, carried out by men who had no conception of what they were destroying and no interest in preserving it. The immediate impact on the manuscript collections was catastrophic, but the long-term consequences were even worse. The sack of 1204 did not merely destroy manuscripts. It destroyed the institutional ecosystem that produced, maintained, and transmitted manuscripts. It destroyed the scriptoria where scribes copied texts. It destroyed the schools where students learned to read and write Greek. It destroyed the scholarly networks through which manuscripts circulated, were borrowed, were studied, and were returned. It destroyed the patronage system through which wealthy individuals and imperial officials funded the production of new manuscripts. And it destroyed the market for books, the demand that drove the copying industry, and that provided the economic incentive for scribes to continue their work. When you destroy a library, you destroy a building and its contents. When you destroy a city's literary culture, you destroy the entire system that creates and sustains libraries, and the recovery takes far longer than the rebuilding of any single building. Nicetas Choniates, the Byzantine historian who witnessed the sack, described the Crusaders' destruction with bitter eloquence. He lamented the loss of the great bronze statue of Athena, attributed to the sculptor Phidias, that had stood in the Forum of Constantine for nearly 900 years. He described the desecration of the Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom, by drunken soldiers who placed a prostitute on the patriarchal throne and had her sing bawdy songs. He catalogued the destruction of artistic and literary treasures that had been accumulated over centuries, and that represented the tangible connection between the Byzantine present and the classical past. The Latin occupation of Constantinople, which lasted from 1204 to 1261, was almost as damaging as the initial sack. During this period, the city was ruled by Western European nobility, who had no interest in maintaining Byzantine institutions, including the library system. The Imperial Library, to the extent that it survived the sack, was neglected, its holdings dispersed or deteriorating. The scholarly community that had given the library its intellectual purpose was scattered, with many Byzantine scholars fleeing to the successor states that had been established in Nicaea, Trebizond, and Epirus. These exile communities maintained their own smaller libraries and scriptoria, continuing the work of copying and preserving texts on a reduced scale, but they could not replace the resources and the critical mass that Constantinople had provided. The damage inflicted by the Latin occupation extended far beyond the physical destruction of manuscripts. The occupations disrupted the institutional continuity of the Byzantine scholarly tradition, breaking the chains of master and student, of teacher and school, of patron and scriptorium that had sustained the production and transmission of manuscripts for centuries. When a scriptorium is destroyed, it is not merely a building that is lost. It is a community of trained professionals, a network of skills and knowledge about manuscript production, a tradition of editorial standards and scholarly practice, and an institutional memory about which texts are held where and which texts are in need of copying. These intangible assets, which take generations to develop and which cannot be rebuilt quickly, were severely damaged by the occupation. The Latin rulers of Constantinople showed no interest in supporting the production of Greek manuscripts. They established Latin Rite churches and monasteries, appointed Latin bishops and abbots, and imposed a system of feudal administration that subordinated the interests of the Greek-speaking population to those of the Latin conquerors. The Greek intellectual elite, who had been the principal patrons and consumers of manuscript production, were marginalized, impoverished, or driven into exile. The market for Greek books, which had sustained the copying industry, collapsed. The scriptoria that had produced Greek manuscripts closed or were converted to other uses. The result was a 57-year interruption in the production of Greek manuscripts in Constantinople, a gap that could never be fully compensated. The economic impact was particularly severe. The Latin occupation impoverished Constantinople dramatically. The Crusaders stripped the city of its portable wealth, melting down bronze monuments for coin, confiscating gold and silver from churches and palaces, and selling the city's artistic and cultural treasures to dealers and collectors across Europe. The economic infrastructure that had supported the city's cultural institutions was dismantled. The tax revenues that had funded the Imperial Library, the university, and the patriarchal administration were redirected to the Latin conquerors and their feudal dependencies. When the Byzantines returned in 1261, they inherited a city that was physically and economically devastated, a city that would never fully recover its former prosperity or its former cultural vitality. When the Byzantines recaptured Constantinople in 1261 under the Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos, they found a city that was a shadow of its former self. The population had declined dramatically. Buildings were in ruins. Institutions had collapsed. The literary infrastructure, the scriptoria, the libraries, the schools, and the scholarly networks that had sustained Byzantine intellectual life for centuries had been severely damaged. The task of rebuilding was immense, and the resources available for it were far more limited than they had been in earlier periods. The late Byzantine Empire was a diminished state, besieged by enemies on every frontier, struggling to maintain even basic administrative functions, and unable to devote the kind of sustained investment to library building and manuscript preservation that its predecessors had managed. The scale of the disruption to manuscript production during the Latin occupation can be measured approximately, by examining the dates of surviving Byzantine manuscripts. Paleographers, the scholars who study the history of handwriting, can date most Byzantine manuscripts within a century or so based on the style of their script, their parchment, their decoration, and other physical characteristics. An examination of the surviving corpus of Byzantine manuscripts reveals a significant decline in the number of manuscripts produced during the period of the Latin occupation, roughly 1204 to 1261, while manuscripts continued to be produced in the exile communities at Nicaea, Trebizond, and Epirus. The total output was far lower than it had been in the decades before the occupation. The 57-year interruption represented not merely a pause in production, but a permanent loss of copying opportunities. Texts that might have been copied during those 57 years were not copied, and some of them were never copied at all, because the manuscripts from which they would have been copied were themselves deteriorating and would eventually become unreadable. The recovery after 1261 was genuine but limited. The Palaeologan emperors, despite their constrained resources, invested in the rebuilding of Constantinople's cultural institutions. They funded scriptoria, patronized scholars, and encouraged the copying and study of classical texts. But the resources available for manuscript production were a fraction of what they had been before the Fourth Crusade, and the scholars who worked during this period were acutely aware that they were working against time. The awareness of impending loss drove some of the most important preservation efforts of the late Byzantine period. Cardinal Bessarion's decision to donate his collection of approximately 900 Greek manuscripts to the city of Venice was motivated explicitly by his fear that Greek learning would be lost if it remained concentrated in the eastern Mediterranean. In the dedicatory letter that accompanied his donation, Bessarion expressed his concern that the Turkish conquests had already destroyed or scattered many Greek libraries, and that the surviving collections were in danger of being lost entirely. He chose Venice as the recipient because it was a stable, prosperous republic with strong connections to the Greek-speaking world, and because he believed that a library in Venice would be accessible to scholars from across Europe in a way that a library in Constantinople, had it survived, might not have been. Bessarion's collection was one of the finest and most carefully curated assemblages of Greek manuscripts ever created by a single individual. It included works by Homer, Plato, Aristotle, the Greek tragedians, the historians, and the scientists, along with theological and philosophical texts from the Byzantine period. Many of the manuscripts were produced in Constantinople's scriptoria during the 14th and 15th centuries and represent the final flowering of the Byzantine manuscript tradition. The collection is now housed in the Biblioteca Nazionale Marciana in Venice, where it remains one of the most important resources for the study of ancient Greek literature and Byzantine scholarly culture. The Palaeologan period from 1261 to 1453 was paradoxically both a golden age of Byzantine scholarship and a period of accelerating loss. The scholars of this period, including Maximus Planudes, Theodore Metachites, Demetrios Triclinios, and Gemistos Plethon, produced some of the most sophisticated work in the history of Byzantine learning. They edited classical texts, wrote commentaries, translated Latin works into Greek, and engaged in philosophical and scientific discussions that anticipated, in some respects, the intellectual concerns of the Italian Renaissance. But they were working in an environment of material scarcity, in a state that was shrinking year by year, that was losing territory, population, and revenue to the advancing Ottoman Turks, and that could not guarantee the physical safety of its remaining manuscript collections. Maximus Planudes, working in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, was one of the most important figures in the late Byzantine recovery. He translated Latin works into Greek, including texts by Ovid, Augustine, Boethius, and Macrobius, and he edited and compiled anthologies of Greek literature, including the famous Greek anthology of epigrams, that preserved short poems by hundreds of ancient and Byzantine poets. Planudes also worked on mathematical and scientific texts, producing editions and commentaries that helped to maintain the vitality of the Greek mathematical tradition. His edition of Ptolemy's Geography which included maps that he reconstructed from Ptolemy's textual descriptions, was one of the most influential scholarly productions of the late Byzantine period and played a significant role in the development of Renaissance cartography. Theodore Metachites, a statesman and scholar who served as chief minister to the Emperor Andronikos II in the early 14th century, was an avid book collector who assembled one of the finest private libraries of his time. His intellectual interests ranged across philosophy, astronomy, rhetoric, and history, and his written works, which fill several volumes in modern editions, are among the most substantial productions of late Byzantine scholarship. But Metachites' career also illustrates the vulnerability of private collections in the turbulent late Byzantine period. When Andronikos II was overthrown by his grandson in 1328, Metachites was stripped of his offices and property, and his library was dispersed. He spent his final years in the monastery of the Chora, whose church he had magnificently restored, mourning the loss of his books and the collapse of the political world in which he had functioned. Demetrios Triclinios, working in Thessalonica in the early 14th century, produced some of the most important editions of classical Greek poetry, including the works of Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and Pindar. His editions were based on careful comparison of multiple manuscripts, and they incorporated metrical analysis that represented the most advanced understanding of ancient Greek poetic meter achieved by any medieval scholar. Triclinios's work preserved readings that might otherwise have been lost and provided the foundation for subsequent editions of the Greek poets that were produced during the Renaissance. Gemistos Plethon, the most radical philosopher of the late Byzantine period, advocated a return to the philosophy of Plato and the ancient Greek gods, a position that was deeply controversial in the Christian Byzantine context. His philosophical works, including the treatise on the differences between Plato and Aristotle, sparked intense debate in both Byzantine and Italian intellectual circles and contributed to the revival of Platonic philosophy that became one of the defining features of the Italian Renaissance. Plethon's influence on the development of Florentine Neoplatonism through his personal contacts with Italian humanists during the Council of Florence in 1438 and 1439 was significant and enduring. The intellectual achievements of the Paleologan scholars were achieved despite, not because of, the political and economic conditions in which they worked. They were the brilliant last flowering of a civilization that was dying, and they knew it. The sense of impending catastrophe, of a great tradition about to be extinguished, pervades the writings of late Byzantine scholars. They wrote with an urgency that reflected their awareness that the time for preservation was running out, that the manuscripts in their care might not survive the political convulsions that were closing in around them. Some of these scholars took proactive measures to save what they could. Manuel Chrysoloras, a Byzantine diplomat and scholar, travelled to Italy in the late 14th century and taught Greek to Italian humanists, sparking a wave of interest in Greek learning that would become one of the driving forces of the Italian Renaissance. Cardinal Bessarion, a Greek-born scholar and churchman, assembled a personal collection of approximately 900 Greek manuscripts, one of the finest collections of its time, and donated it to the city of Venice in 1468, where it became the core of the Bibliotheca Marciana and remains one of the most important repositories of Byzantine manuscripts in the world. George of Trebizond, another Greek scholar who emigrated to Italy, translated Greek texts into Latin and worked to make Greek learning accessible to Western European readers. These individual acts of preservation were heroic, but they were also fragmentary. Bessarion's 900 manuscripts represented a tiny fraction of the total holdings of Constantinople's libraries. The manuscripts that were carried to Italy by emigrating scholars were a self-selected sample, reflecting the individual interests and priorities of the scholars who chose them. A scholar who specialized in Aristotelian philosophy would bring Aristotelian manuscripts. A scholar who specialized in Platonic philosophy would bring Platonic manuscripts. A scholar who specialized in rhetoric would bring rhetorical texts. The resulting collections in Italy were rich in certain categories of Greek literature and sparse in others, reflecting not the full range of what Constantinople's libraries had contained, but the personal interests of the men who fled the dying city. But here is the problem. The manuscripts that were not carried to Italy, that were not donated to Western libraries, that were not copied by Western scholars, were left to face whatever fate awaited them in the conquered city. And the fate that awaited them was, for many, destruction. The Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, who conquered Constantinople in 1453, was, by all accounts, a cultured and intellectually curious man who valued learning and patronized scholars. He did not order the destruction of the city's libraries, but the 3-day sack that he permitted his soldiers as a reward for their victory was devastating to the remaining collections. Soldiers who could not read Greek had no reason to preserve manuscripts that were, to them, merely pieces of parchment or paper. The looting, the burning, and the casual destruction that accompanied the sack consumed an unknown but certainly significant number of manuscripts. The eyewitness accounts of the fall are harrowing in their descriptions of cultural destruction. The Greek historian Doukas, writing shortly after the conquest, described scenes of manuscripts being thrown into the streets, trampled by soldiers, burned in campfires, or sold for trivial sums to anyone who would buy them. The Italian merchant Niccolò Barbaro, who was present during the siege and its aftermath, recorded the chaos of the sack in his diary, noting the indiscriminate destruction of property and the desperation of the city's inhabitants as they tried to protect their possessions from the looters. Other accounts describe manuscripts being used as horsebedding, as fuel for cooking fires, or as packing material for more valuable loot. The scale of the destruction is debated among modern historians. Some scholars argue that the loss was relatively contained, pointing to the survival of significant manuscript collections in monasteries and private hands that were either spared during the sack or quickly recovered afterward. Others argue that the loss was catastrophic, noting that the majority of the city's institutional libraries, including the Imperial Library, the Patriarchal Library, and the libraries of the major monasteries within the city walls, were likely destroyed or severely damaged during the 3-day sack and the subsequent period of Ottoman settlement. In the years following the conquest, some manuscripts were acquired by Ottoman scholars and officials who recognized their value. The Ottoman court maintained an interest in Greek learning, and Greek manuscripts were sometimes collected, studied, and even translated into Arabic or Turkish. Mehmed himself commissioned the Greek scholar George Amirudz to produce a world map based on Ptolemy's geography, demonstrating his personal interest in Greek scientific knowledge. But this preservation effort was selective and unsystematic. It depended on individual initiative rather than institutional commitment, and it saved only a fraction of what had been available. The Ottoman period also saw the gradual dispersal of manuscripts that had survived the conquest intact. Greek manuscripts from Constantinople found their way into private collections across the Ottoman Empire and beyond. Some ended up in monasteries on Mount Athos, where they were preserved alongside the monks' own collections. Some were purchased by Western European collectors and diplomats who travelled through the Ottoman Empire in search of Greek manuscripts. The French diplomat and scholar Pierre Gilles, who visited Constantinople in the 1540s, described finding Greek manuscripts being sold in the markets of the city, their contents unknown to the merchants who offered them. The Austrian diplomat Ogier Ghiselin de Busbecq, who served as ambassador to the Ottoman court in the 1550s, purchased Greek manuscripts during his stay and brought them back to Europe, where they entered the Imperial Library in Vienna. Some manuscripts were acquired by the Ottoman Imperial Library, where they were stored alongside Arabic, Persian, and Turkish texts, and some simply disappeared, their fates unknown, their locations unrecorded, their contents unknowable. The total loss is staggering. The Imperial Library of Constantinople at its peak held an estimated 120,000 volumes. The total holdings of all Byzantine libraries in the capital, including monastic, patriarchal, private, and academic collections, may have been several times that number. Of this enormous aggregate collection, only a fraction survived the successive catastrophes of fire, the Fourth Crusade, the Latin occupation, and the Ottoman conquest. The exact fraction is impossible to calculate, but the most informed estimates suggest that the vast majority of what the libraries held was lost. We possess today roughly 55,000 Byzantine manuscripts in libraries and collections around the world. This is a substantial number, but it represents only a fraction of what Constantinople's libraries once contained, and it includes manuscripts from all periods and all locations within the Byzantine world, not just from Constantinople itself. The siege of 1453 itself lasted from April 6th to May 29th, a period of nearly 8 weeks during which the city was subjected to bombardment by the largest cannons that had ever been used in warfare. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed had commissioned a Hungarian engineer named Orban to construct a massive bronze cannon capable of firing stone balls weighing over 500 kilograms. This weapon, along with dozens of smaller cannons, battered the Theodosian walls continuously, opening breaches that the defenders repeatedly attempted to repair under fire. The psychological impact of the bombardment on the city's inhabitants was immense. The sound of the great cannon firing could be heard from miles away, and the walls that had withstood every siege for over 1,000 years were visibly crumbling. Inside the besieged city, the population of roughly 50,000 civilians and a defending garrison of perhaps 7,000 soldiers lived under conditions of extreme stress and deprivation. Food was scarce, morale was fragile, religious processions wound through the streets as the population prayed for divine intervention. The Emperor Constantine XI, the last Byzantine emperor, organized the defense with determination and courage, but knew that without significant Western reinforcement, which never came, the city could not hold out indefinitely against the vastly superior Ottoman forces. When the walls were finally breached on the morning of May 29th, the Ottoman troops poured into the city and the 3-day sack began. The sack was the customary reward that Ottoman sultans granted their troops for taking a city by assault rather than by negotiated surrender. For 3 days, the soldiers had the right to take whatever they could carry, including human captives who could be sold as slaves. The resulting devastation was not targeted or systematic. It was chaotic, violent, and indiscriminate, affecting every neighborhood, every institution, and every social class in the conquered city. The fate of Constantinople's remaining manuscripts during and after the sack depended on a complex mix of factors: the location of the manuscripts within the city, the alertness or indifference of the soldiers who entered the buildings where they were stored, the presence or absence of individuals who recognized their value and intervened to protect them, and simple luck. Manuscripts in well-built stone buildings were more likely to survive than manuscripts in wooden structures that could be easily burned. Manuscripts in monasteries that were quickly placed under Ottoman protection were more likely to survive than manuscripts in institutions that were not protected. Manuscripts that were physically inconspicuous, stored in chests or hidden in cellars, were more likely to survive than manuscripts that were displayed prominently or that attracted attention because of their illuminated covers or gold leaf decoration. The manuscripts that survive are, moreover, not a representative sample of what was lost. They are a biased sample, shaped by the same forces of selection that operated throughout the library's history: educational utility, religious orthodoxy, literary prestige, and simple chance. The canonical texts of Greek literature, Homer, Plato, Aristotle, the tragedians, the historians, survive in many manuscripts because they were the texts most frequently copied and most widely distributed. The rare and specialized texts, the minor poets, the obscure philosophers, the technical manuals, the provincial histories, the lost scientific treatises, these are the texts that were most likely to have been lost, because they existed in the fewest copies and were the least likely to have been selected for preservation at any of the critical bottlenecks in the transmission process. The survival statistics vary dramatically by genre and by author. Homer survives in hundreds of manuscripts, reflecting his central position in the Byzantine educational curriculum. The works of Plato and Aristotle survive in dozens of manuscripts each, reflecting their importance in philosophical and theological education. The Greek tragedians survive in a handful of manuscripts, reflecting their continued literary prestige but more limited educational role. The minor Greek poets, the technical writers, and the specialized scientific authors often survive in a single manuscript or a small number of closely related manuscripts, reflecting the narrow margins by which their works escaped oblivion. For every author who survives in 100 manuscripts, there are authors who survive in only one. And for every author who survives in one manuscript, there are dozens or hundreds whose works survive in none at all. But here is what makes this truly terrifying. The Bibliotheca of Photius, that 9th century catalogue of reading, describes 279 works that the Patriarch had read. Of those 279, roughly half are now lost. Photius was reading these works in Constantinople in the 9th century, when the Imperial Library was at or near its peak. He had access to a collection that was, by any standard, one of the richest in the history of human civilization, and half of what he read has vanished. If half the works available to a 9th century patriarch are now gone, the total loss from the library's complete holdings, including the works that Photius did not happen to read or did not happen to include in his catalogue, must be even greater. The specific works that Photius describes and that are now lost include histories, novels, theological treatises, orations, and technical works that would be of incalculable value to modern scholars. He describes the history of Ctesias of Cnidus, a Greek physician who served at the Persian court and wrote accounts of Persia and India that provided a non-Greek perspective on the great empires of the Near East. He describes the novels of Iamblichus, Antonius Diogenes, and other authors of ancient Greek prose fiction, a genre that was far more diverse and more popular in antiquity than the surviving examples suggest. He describes the orations of Hyperides, one of the most celebrated Athenian orators, whose works are now known only from a handful of papyrus fragments recovered from the Egyptian sands. He describes theological and philosophical works by authors whose names are otherwise unknown, whose contributions to the intellectual life of the ancient and early Byzantine world are invisible to us because their texts did not survive. The Suda, a massive Byzantine encyclopedia compiled in the 10th century, provides additional evidence of the scale of the loss. The Suda contains approximately 30,000 entries on words, historical events, and biographical sketches of ancient and Byzantine figures. It draws on hundreds of earlier sources, many of which are now lost. The entries in the Suda frequently cite or quote from works that are not available in any surviving manuscript, providing fragmentary evidence of a literary and intellectual tradition that was far richer than the surviving texts can convey. Like the Bibliotheca of Photius, the Suda is simultaneously a record of what the Byzantines knew and a record of what we have lost. Each entry that cites a lost source is a window into a library that no longer exists, a brief glimpse of a text that someone in 10th century Constantinople could read in full, but that we can access only through this single, compressed, and inevitably incomplete summary. The cumulative evidence from Photius, the Suda, the Constantinian excerpts, and other Byzantine reference works allows scholars to compile partial inventories of the texts that were available in Constantinople at various points in its history. These inventories are sobering in their implications. They reveal a literary world that was vastly richer, more diverse, and more complex than the surviving corpus of ancient Greek literature can convey. They show that the Byzantines had access to hundreds of ancient authors whose works are now entirely lost, to thousands of individual texts that have vanished without leaving more than a passing reference in a later source. They demonstrate with painful clarity that the surviving canon of ancient Greek literature is a tiny, biased, and deeply incomplete sample of what was actually available in the libraries of Constantinople. The numbers tell a story that is difficult to absorb. 120,000 volumes at the library's peak, 55,000 surviving Byzantine manuscripts worldwide, from all periods and all locations, an unknown but certainly large number of those surviving manuscripts deriving not from the Imperial Library but from monastic, private, and provincial collections that were never part of the Imperial system. The fraction of the Imperial Library's holdings that actually survive to the present day may be as low as 10%, and for certain categories of texts, particularly rare and specialized works, the survival rate may be much lower still. For the unique texts, the works that existed in only 1 or 2 copies at the time of each successive catastrophe, the survival rate approaches 0. It is these unique texts, the ones that no amount of recovery effort can ever hope to replace, that represent the most painful and most permanent and most irreversible element of the loss. The story of what was lost in Constantinople is also, inevitably, a story about what was saved and about the extraordinary efforts that scholars have made over 5 centuries and more to recover, reconstruct, and understand the fragments that survived. These efforts have taken many forms, from the physical recovery of manuscripts hidden in remote monasteries to the painstaking reconstruction of lost works from scattered quotations in surviving texts. Each form of recovery has its own methods, its own limitations, and its own contribution to the ongoing project of measuring the void that the library's destruction created. Let us begin with the most direct form of recovery, the rediscovery of manuscripts in locations where they had been preserved, often unknowingly, for centuries. The monasteries of Mount Athos, the holy mountain on the eastern prong of the Chalcidice Peninsula in northern Greece, have been one of the richest sources of Byzantine manuscript discoveries. Mount Athos has been a center of Eastern Orthodox monasticism since the 10th century, and its 20 ruling monasteries, along with numerous smaller communities, maintained libraries that accumulated manuscripts over a period of more than 1,000 years. The monks of Athos copied, collected, donated, and preserved manuscripts as part of their religious and intellectual life, and their libraries preserved texts that had disappeared from every other collection in the Byzantine and post-Byzantine world. The manuscript holdings of Mount Athos are estimated at approximately 12,000 to 15,000 manuscripts, making it the largest concentration of Byzantine manuscripts outside the great national libraries of Europe. Many of these manuscripts have been catalogued and studied by modern scholars, but the process is far from complete. The libraries of Athos are difficult to access, both physically, since the peninsula has no road connections to the mainland and can be reached only by boat, and administratively, since access to the monastic libraries requires special permission and is subject to restrictions that reflect the monks' understandable desire to protect their collections from damage and theft. Among the treasures of Mount Athos are manuscripts that preserve unique or rare texts not found in any other surviving collection. The monastery of Vatopedi, for example, holds a 10th century manuscript of Ptolemy's geography that is one of the oldest and most complete copies of this foundational work of ancient cartography and geographical science. The monastery of Aviron holds manuscripts of ancient medical texts that provide evidence of Byzantine medical practice and the transmission of Hippocratic and Galenic medicine. The monastery of the Great Lavra, the oldest and largest community on Athos, holds a library of over 2,000 manuscripts that includes some of the finest examples of Byzantine calligraphy and illumination. But the Athos libraries, for all their richness, represent only one channel of survival. The manuscripts they contain are, in most cases, religious or theological in nature, reflecting the priorities of the monastic communities that collected them. Secular texts, scientific works, philosophical treatises, and literary compositions are less well represented in monastic collections, for the obvious reason that monks were primarily interested in texts that served their spiritual and liturgical needs. The survival of secular Greek literature depended more heavily on the manuscripts that were carried to Italy by emigrating Byzantine scholars and on the copies that were produced in the secular scriptoria of Constantinople before its fall. The Italian collections that were assembled by Byzantine émigrés and their Western patrons represent a second major channel of survival. The collection of Cardinal Bessarion, donated to Venice in 1468, is the most famous example, but it was far from the only one. The Medici family in Florence assembled a substantial collection of Greek manuscripts, many of them acquired through agents who purchased texts from Byzantine scholars and from the remnants of Byzantine collections. The Vatican Library acquired Greek manuscripts through various channels, including diplomatic gifts, purchases, and the collections of Greek-born cardinals and scholars. The royal libraries of France, England, and Spain all acquired Byzantine manuscripts during the 15th and 16th centuries, often through intermediaries who travelled in the eastern Mediterranean and purchased texts from monasteries, private collectors, and dealers. These Italian and Western European collections preserved many of the most important surviving texts of ancient Greek literature and science. The manuscripts of Plato, Aristotle, Homer, the Greek tragedians, the historians, and the scientists that we use today are, in many cases, copies that were produced in Constantinople during the Byzantine period, and that reached the West through one of these channels of transmission. The Western recovery of Greek learning during the Renaissance was, in the most literal sense, a Byzantine export, carried by Greek hands across the Mediterranean to Italian libraries, where it was received with an enthusiasm that reflected centuries of cultural deprivation. But the manuscripts that reached the West were a selected, not a complete sample of what Constantinople's libraries had held. The selection was shaped by the interests of the scholars who carried them, the tastes of the patrons who funded their acquisition, and the market forces that determined which texts were commercially valuable. Texts that were in high demand among Italian humanists, particularly the works of Plato, Aristotle, Homer, and the Greek orators, were actively sought out and purchased at premium prices. Texts that were less in demand, scientific and mathematical works, technical treatises, minor literary compositions, provincial histories, were less likely to be purchased and less likely to make the journey to the West. Let that sink in. The texts that survive from the Imperial Library of Constantinople are the texts that someone, at some point in the chain of transmission, judged to be worth the effort and expense of preservation. The texts that are lost are the texts that no one, at any point in the chain, made that judgment for. The distinction between survival and loss was determined not by the intrinsic quality or importance of the texts, but by the priorities, the interests, and the financial calculations of the individuals who controlled the channels of transmission. Now consider the specific categories of loss. The lost works of ancient Greek literature that were available in Constantinople but did not survive. The city's fall include texts in virtually every genre and discipline. The Greek lyric poets are among the most painful losses. Sappho, Alcaeus, Pindar, Bacchylides, Simonides, Alcman, Stesichorus, Ibycus, and Anacreon were all represented in the Byzantine educational curriculum to varying degrees, and their works were available in Constantinople for centuries. But the survival of their texts through the Ottoman conquest was uneven, and in most cases, catastrophically incomplete. Sappho, who was arguably the most celebrated female poet in the history of Western literature, survived the medieval transmission process with approximately one complete poem and a collection of fragments. The Byzantine scholar Maximus Planudes, working in the late 13th century, compiled an anthology of Greek poetry that included selections from several of the lyric poets, but his anthology preserved only brief excerpts, not complete works. The full texts of the lyric poets, which had been available in Constantinople as late as the 12th or 13th century, were lost during the successive catastrophes that struck the city. The ancient Greek historians suffered similarly devastating losses. Polybius wrote a universal history in 40 books. Only the first 5 survive complete, along with substantial fragments of the remaining 35. The rest was available in Constantinople and is now gone. Diodorus Siculus wrote a universal history in 40 books, about 15 survive in complete or substantially complete form. The lost books covered periods and regions of ancient history that are poorly documented in any other surviving source, including detailed accounts of the wars of Alexander's successors and the early history of Rome that would transform our understanding of those pivotal periods if they could be recovered. Cassius Dio wrote a Roman history in 80 books covering the period from the founding of Rome to his own time in the 3rd century of the Common Era. Roughly a third survives in complete form, with much of the remainder known only through Byzantine epitomes and excerpts, the condensed summaries produced by later scholars who had access to the complete text but chose to abridge it rather than copy it in full. The lost portions of Cassius Dio include detailed accounts of events that are poorly documented in any other surviving source, including the internal politics of the Roman Empire during some of its most turbulent periods. Appian wrote a Roman history, organized not chronologically but by region, describing Rome's wars and conquests in each area of the Mediterranean world. His work survived in highly uneven condition. The books on the civil wars are substantially complete, but the books on many regional conflicts are entirely lost or survive only in fragments. The lost sections included detailed accounts of Rome's wars in the Western Mediterranean that would fill significant gaps in our knowledge of the expansion of the Roman Republic. The Byzantine historian and literary scholar John Tzetzes, working in the 12th century, produced commentaries and encyclopedic works that quoted extensively from ancient texts that were still available in Constantinople during his lifetime, but have since been lost. Tzetzes' works are a treasure trove for modern scholars because his quotations preserve passages from lost historians, lost poets, and lost mythographers that are found nowhere else in the surviving record. His commentary on Lycurgus Alexandria, for example, draws on dozens of ancient sources that are now lost, and his epistolary autobiography, the Chiliades, is a rich source of information about the literary culture of 12th century Constantinople. The epitome tradition deserves special attention because it represents a uniquely Byzantine form of both preservation and loss. Byzantine scholars frequently produced epitomes or excerpts of longer works, condensing the original text into a shorter and more manageable summary. These epitomes were useful as reference works, and were often the form in which large historical or encyclopedic works circulated in the later Byzantine period. But the production of an epitome often led to the neglect and eventual loss of the original. Once a reliable epitome was available, there was less incentive to copy the full text, and the full text was more likely to deteriorate and disappear. The epitomes preserved the basic factual content of the original works, but lost the style, the nuance, the detailed argumentation, and the original author's voice. The numbers are striking when we examine the survival rates for specific categories of ancient Greek literature available in Constantinople. Ancient Greek comedy provides a telling example. Aristophanes wrote approximately 40 plays, 11 survive. Menander wrote over 100 plays. Only one survives in substantially complete form, with fragments of several others recovered from papyri. The other comic poets of the Old, Middle, and New Comedy traditions, Cratinus, Eupolis, Alexis, Philemon, Diphilus, and dozens of others, survive only in fragments, many of them preserved solely through quotations in later authors. The total number of ancient Greek comedies produced during the classical and Hellenistic periods probably ran into the thousands. Fewer than 20 survive in complete or substantially complete form. The loss of ancient comedy is particularly significant because comedy was the genre most directly engaged with the everyday life, social customs, and popular culture of the ancient world. Tragedy dealt with myths and heroes, history dealt with wars and politics, philosophy dealt with abstract ideas, comedy dealt with ordinary people, their marriages, their debts, their family quarrels, their anxieties about money and status and love. The lost comedies would have provided a window into the daily texture of ancient Greek life that no other genre can replace. When we imagine ancient Athens, we imagine the Parthenon, the philosophers in the Agora, the warriors at Marathon and Salamis. We do not imagine the shopkeepers, the cooks, the slaves, the wives, the children, the farmers who made up the vast majority of the population, because the texts that depicted their lives most vividly, the comedies, are almost entirely gone. Ancient Greek philosophy presents a similar picture of devastating loss. The works of the pre-Socratic philosophers, the founders of the Western philosophical tradition, survive almost entirely in fragments. The complete works of Chrysippus, who was arguably the most important Stoic philosopher and who wrote over 700 individual works, are entirely lost. The original works of Epicurus, who founded one of the most influential philosophical schools in the ancient world, survive in the form of 3 letters, a collection of maxims and fragments. The works of the skeptic philosophers, including Pyrrho and his followers, are known primarily through the later summary provided by Sextus Empiricus, whose own works survived the Byzantine transmission by a narrow margin. The intellectual poverty of our access to these foundational thinkers is staggering. We discuss the origins of Western philosophy based on second-hand reports, hostile summaries, and scattered quotations because the original texts have been lost. The mathematical and scientific texts that passed through Constantinople present a particularly complex pattern of survival and loss. The major mathematical works, Euclid's Elements, the surviving books of Apollonius's Conics, and several works of Archimedes, survived because they were actively studied in the Byzantine educational system and were therefore copied with sufficient frequency to ensure their preservation. But the minor mathematical works, the treatises by lesser-known mathematicians on specialized topics, the practical manuals on surveying, engineering, and applied mathematics, survived at much lower rates. The works of Pappus of Alexandria, a 4th century mathematician who wrote a comprehensive survey of Greek mathematical achievement called the Mathematical Collection, survived in a single manuscript tradition, meaning that their survival depended on the preservation of a single line of copying. If that one line had been broken at any point, if one scribe had decided not to copy the text, or if one manuscript had been destroyed by fire or flood, the entire work would have been lost. The survival of Pappus depended not on the systematic operation of an institutional preservation system, but on a chain of individual decisions, each one potentially the last stretching across 7 centuries. The case of Diophantus, the ancient mathematician whose work on algebraic methods influenced the development of modern algebra, illustrates the same vulnerability. Diophantus's Arithmetica originally comprised 13 books. Only 6 survive in Greek, and 4 more were discovered in an Arabic translation in the 20th century. 3 books remain entirely lost. The surviving Greek books based on a small number of closely related manuscripts, all of them descended from a single Byzantine exemplar. If that exemplar had been lost, the entire Greek tradition of Diophantus would have vanished, and our knowledge of his contributions to mathematics would have been limited to the Arabic translation and the references in later authors. These cases of single tradition survival are far more common than most people realize. A significant number of the ancient Greek texts that we possess today survive through a single Byzantine manuscript or a small family of closely related manuscripts. Their survival was not guaranteed by any system of distributed copying. It was the result of a chain of accidents, a chain in which the loss of a single link would have meant the permanent disappearance of the text. The fragility of these single tradition texts is a sobering reminder of how close we have come, on numerous occasions, to losing works that are now regarded as foundational texts of Western civilization. The survival of Archimedes provides a dramatic illustration of how narrow the channels of transmission could be. The most famous surviving manuscript of Archimedes, the Archimedes palimpsest, is a 13th century prayer book that was created by scraping the ink off an older 10th century manuscript of Archimedes' works and reusing the parchment for liturgical texts. The original mathematical text was almost completely invisible to the naked eye, hidden beneath the prayers that had been written over it. The palimpsest was discovered in an Istanbul library in the early 20th century, studied briefly, and then lost to scholarship for decades before being rediscovered in the 1990s and subjected to intensive analysis using multispectral imaging and other advanced technologies. The imaging revealed previously unknown works by Archimedes, including the method of mechanical theorems, which describes the physical intuitions that guided his mathematical discoveries, and the Stomachion, a treatise on a geometrical puzzle that represents one of the earliest known works in the field of combinatorics. The Archimedes palimpsest is a microcosm of the larger story of Constantinople's libraries, a work of extraordinary intellectual importance, produced by one of the greatest minds in human history, survived by the narrowest possible margin, preserved not by deliberate care, but by the accidental consequences of a medieval monk's need for parchment. The monk who scraped off Archimedes' text to reuse the parchment did not know what he was destroying. He could not read the mathematical notation. He needed writing material, and the old manuscript provided it. His act of destruction was also, inadvertently, an act of preservation, because the faint traces of the original text survived beneath the overwritten prayers for 700 years until technology advanced to the point where they could be recovered. But here is the problem. The Archimedes palimpsest was found. How many similar palimpsests containing other lost works by other ancient authors have not been found? How many were scraped, reused, and eventually destroyed without anyone ever suspecting that they contained hidden texts? The practice of reusing parchment, known as palimpsesting, was common throughout the medieval period in both the Byzantine and the Western European scriptoria. Parchment was expensive, and old manuscripts whose texts were considered obsolete or unimportant were frequently recycled. Each act of palimpsesting destroyed or obscured a text that might have been the last surviving copy of a lost work. The cumulative effect of this practice, sustained over centuries across thousands of scriptoria, was enormous. Modern technology has opened new possibilities for reading palimpsests and recovering hidden texts. Multispectral imaging, which captures images of a manuscript under different wavelengths of light, can reveal text that is invisible to the naked eye. X-ray fluorescence mapping can detect the chemical traces of iron-based inks even when the ink itself has been scraped away. These technologies have been applied to numerous palimpsests, with remarkable results, recovering texts by ancient and medieval authors that were previously thought to be irretrievably lost. The Sinai Palimpsests Project, for example, has used multispectral imaging to read overwritten texts in the manuscripts of St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai, one of the oldest continuously operating monasteries in the world. The project has recovered texts in a dozen languages, including Greek, Syriac, Arabic, Latin, and several others, some of them preserving unique versions of religious and literary texts that are not found in any other surviving source. The potential for further discoveries of this kind is significant, since thousands of palimpsests exist in libraries and collections around the world, many of them not yet subjected to modern imaging analysis. The Sinai discoveries have also highlighted the multilingual character of the ancient and medieval scholarly world. The texts recovered from the Sinai palimpsests include not only Greek and Latin works, but also texts in Caucasian Albanian, Christian Palestinian Aramaic, and other languages that are poorly represented in the surviving manuscript record. Some of these recovered texts are the oldest known specimens of their respective languages, providing crucial evidence for the history of writing and literary culture in regions that are poorly documented by other sources. The discovery reminds us that the loss of knowledge caused by the destruction of libraries is not limited to the Greek and Latin traditions. It extends to every language and every culture that produced written texts, and the full scope of the loss across all these traditions is far greater than any single library's destruction can convey. The potential for further palimpsest recoveries is substantial. Libraries across Europe and the Middle East contain thousands of medieval manuscripts that have never been subjected to modern imaging analysis. Some of these manuscripts may contain hidden texts beneath their visible writing, texts that were scraped away centuries ago, but that left traces that modern technology can detect. The systematic imaging of palimpsests in the world's major manuscript collections would be an expensive and time-consuming project, but it could yield discoveries of enormous significance. Every palimpsest that is read is a potential window into the lost literature of the ancient world, a chance to recover a text that has been hidden for centuries beneath the prayers and sermons of medieval monks. The Islamic translation movement represents another angle from which the losses of Constantinople's libraries can be partially assessed and, in some cases, partially compensated. During the 9th and 10th centuries, Arab scholars translated hundreds of Greek scientific and philosophical texts into Arabic, working from Greek manuscripts that were obtained from Byzantine sources. These Arabic translations preserved the substance of the Greek originals, and in some cases, the Arabic versions survived when the Greek originals were subsequently lost. The works of Apollonius of Perga on conic sections, for example, survive in the original Greek for only 4 of the 8 books. 3 additional books survive only in Arabic translation, the work of the 9th century translator Thabit ibn Qurra. The 8th book is entirely lost, The Arabic translations provide an independent line of evidence about the contents of Greek scientific and mathematical literature that was available in Constantinople and its surrounding territories during the early medieval period. By comparing the Arabic translations with the surviving Greek texts, scholars can assess the quality and completeness of the transmission, identify passages that were corrupted or lost in the Greek tradition, and in some cases, recover readings that have been lost from all surviving Greek manuscripts. But the Arabic translations have their own limitations. They were produced by translators who were working across a significant linguistic and cultural divide, and the translations inevitably introduced distortions, simplifications, and errors. Arabic and Greek have different syntactic structures, different philosophical vocabularies, and different conventions for expressing technical concepts. A translation from Greek to Arabic is never a perfect reproduction of the original. It is an interpretation, shaped by the translator's understanding of the subject matter, the translator's command of both languages, and the quality of the Greek manuscript that the translator was working from. The Arabic translations are valuable supplements to the Greek tradition, but they cannot replace the lost Greek originals. The story of the Constantinopolitan manuscript of Ptolemy's Almagest illustrates the complex interplay between the Greek and Arabic traditions of transmission. Ptolemy's Almagest, the foundational text of ancient mathematical astronomy, was one of the most important scientific works in the Byzantine library system. It was translated into Arabic in the 9th century and became the basis for Islamic astronomy. It was also preserved in the Greek tradition through manuscripts that were copied in Constantinople and its surrounding monastic communities. The earliest surviving Greek manuscript of the Almagest dates to the 9th century and was probably produced in a Byzantine scriptorium. The text as we have it today is based on a comparison of the surviving Greek manuscripts with the Arabic translations, using the two traditions to correct errors in each other and to reconstruct, as nearly as possible, the text that Ptolemy originally wrote. This process of cross-referencing between the Greek and Arabic traditions has been applied to many other ancient scientific texts, including works by Euclid, Archimedes, Galen, and Hippocrates. In each case, the comparison reveals both the strengths and the weaknesses of the two traditions and highlights the extent to which the survival of ancient scientific knowledge depended on the parallel operation of two distinct systems of preservation, one centered in Constantinople and the other in the great libraries of the Islamic world. The existence of this parallel system meant that some texts survived in one tradition even when they were lost in the other. But for texts that were not translated into Arabic, the Byzantine tradition was the only channel of survival, and any failure in that channel meant permanent loss. The case of Galen's medical writings illustrates this point with particular clarity. Galen was one of the most prolific medical writers in ancient history, producing hundreds of individual works on anatomy, physiology, pathology, pharmacology, and clinical practice. Many of his works were translated into Arabic and became the foundation of Islamic medicine. But not all of Galen's works were translated. Some of the more specialized or obscure texts were not included in the Arabic translation program and survived only in the Greek manuscript tradition. When the Greek manuscripts of these works were lost, the texts themselves were lost because no Arabic version existed as a backup. In 2015, a dramatic example of this dynamic came to light when a previously unknown Galenic text was discovered in a palimpsest manuscript in the Viterbo archive in Italy. The text, on the mixtures and powers of simple drugs, had been overwritten with a later text, and the original Galenic writing was invisible to the naked eye. The discovery was made possible by multispectral imaging, the same technology that had been used to read the Archimedes palimpsest. The text preserves Galen's discussion of the properties and uses of various medicinal substances, providing new evidence about ancient pharmacological knowledge and practice. The discovery demonstrates both the potential for future recoveries and the extent of past losses. If this text survived only as invisible traces beneath a later manuscript, how many other Galenic texts were destroyed entirely, leaving no trace at all? The Renaissance recovery of Greek learning from Byzantine sources represents yet another chapter in the story of recovery and loss. When Byzantine scholars began arriving in Italy in significant numbers during the 15th century, they brought with them not only manuscripts, but also the linguistic and scholarly expertise needed to read, edit, and interpret those manuscripts. The Italian humanists who received this influx of Greek learning were, in many cases, encountering ancient texts for the first time, texts that had been available in Constantinople for centuries, but that had been inaccessible to Western Europe because of the language barrier. The excitement that accompanied these discoveries was genuine and transformative. The recovery of Plato's complete dialogues, previously known in the West only through a single dialogue in a 12th century Latin translation, was a watershed moment in the history of Western philosophy. The recovery of the Greek historians, the Greek poets, the Greek scientists and mathematicians opened new windows onto the ancient world that the Latin-only tradition of the medieval West had been unable to provide. The impact on Western European intellectual life was profound and immediate. The Florentine humanist Marsilio Ficino, working under the patronage of Cosimo de' Medici, translated the complete dialogues of Plato into Latin between 1463 and 1477, making Plato's philosophy fully accessible to Western readers for the first time in over 1,000 years. The effect was electrifying. Platonic and Neoplatonic ideas, which had been marginalized in Western thought for centuries in favor of Aristotelian philosophy, suddenly became central to the intellectual discourse of Renaissance Italy. The concept of Platonic love, the theory of ideal forms, the vision of the philosopher king, the allegory of the cave, all of these ideas, which had been available to Byzantine readers for a millennium, burst upon the Western European consciousness with the force of a revelation. Similarly, the recovery of the complete works of the Greek historians transformed the Western understanding of the ancient world. Herodotus, Thucydides, and Xenophon had been known in the West through Latin translations and summaries, but the full range of Greek historical writing, including Polybius, Diodorus, Plutarch, Appian, and Cassius Dio, became available to Western readers only through the manuscripts that Byzantine scholars brought to Italy. These historians provided detailed accounts of periods and events that had been poorly documented in the Latin tradition, and their recovery significantly expanded the Western knowledge of ancient Mediterranean history. But the Renaissance recovery, like every other stage in the transmission process, was selective. The Italian humanists were not systematic scholars in the modern sense. They were enthusiasts, driven by personal passion and intellectual curiosity, and their interests determined which texts were sought out, purchased, translated, and disseminated. The texts that were most in demand, the major philosophical and literary works, the texts that conformed to the humanist aesthetic of classical elegance and rhetorical polish, were the ones that were most actively pursued and most widely circulated. The scientific and mathematical texts, which required specialized training to read and which did not fit easily into the humanist educational program, received less attention and were less likely to be translated, printed, and disseminated. The invention of the printing press, which transformed the production and distribution of books in Western Europe during the second half of the 15th century, created a new bottleneck in the transmission process. The printers who produced the first printed editions of Greek texts had to make choices about which texts to print, and their choices were driven by a combination of scholarly interest and commercial viability. Texts that were expected to sell well, the works of Homer, Plato, Aristotle, and the other canonical authors, were printed early and in relatively large editions. Texts that were expected to appeal only to a narrow audience of specialists were printed later in smaller editions, or not at all. The commercial logic of the printing press thus reinforced the same biases that had operated throughout the manuscript tradition, favouring the canonical and the popular at the expense of the specialized and the obscure. Some ancient texts made it into print only by the narrowest of margins. The Editio Princeps, or first printed edition, of many ancient Greek authors was based on a single manuscript, sometimes a manuscript of questionable quality, simply because it was the only manuscript available to the editor. The first printed edition of the Iliad produced by Demetrius Chalcondyles in Florence in 1488, was based on a small number of Byzantine manuscripts. The first printed edition of the complete works of Aristotle, produced by Aldus Manutius in Venice between 1495 and 1498, was based on manuscripts that Aldus had assembled from various sources, many of them Byzantine in origin. These early printed editions became the standard texts from which subsequent editions were derived, and their readings, including any errors they contained, were transmitted to all subsequent readers. The math is striking when we compare the survival rates across different genres. Approximately 90% of surviving ancient Greek literary texts reached the modern world through Byzantine manuscripts. For scientific and mathematical texts, the figure is even higher, approaching 95% or more for certain categories. These numbers reflect the absolute centrality of Constantinople in the transmission of Greek learning. The Byzantine library system was not merely one channel of preservation among many. It was the primary channel, the main artery, through which the lifeblood of classical Greek knowledge flowed from the ancient world to the modern. When that artery was cut, the flow was severely reduced. The texts that had already been transmitted, that had already been copied and distributed and carried to the West, continued to circulate. But the texts that had not yet been transmitted, that remained in Constantinople's libraries when the city fell, were at the mercy of the soldiers, the fires, and the centuries of neglect that followed. Consider the survival of the ancient Greek mathematical tradition. The works of Euclid, the most widely copied mathematical text in the Byzantine world, survive in numerous manuscripts, the earliest dating to the 9th century. This is because the Elements was a core educational text studied by every Byzantine who received a mathematical education. At the other extreme, the works of Diophantus, the ancient mathematician who developed algebraic methods for solving equations, survive in a much smaller number of manuscripts because Diophantine algebra was a specialized field that was studied by a much smaller community of readers. The works of Heron of Alexandria on pneumatics and automata survive in a handful of manuscripts. The works of Pappus of Alexandria survive in essentially a single manuscript tradition, and the works of many other ancient mathematicians, mentioned by name in the surviving sources, but represented by no surviving text, are entirely gone. The pattern is consistent across all genres. The more widely copied a text was in Byzantium, the more likely it is to survive today. The less widely copied it was, the more likely it is to have been lost. This correlation between copying frequency and survival is not surprising, but its implications are profound. It means that the surviving corpus of ancient Greek knowledge is systematically biased in favor of the popular, the canonical, and the educationally useful, and systematically biased against the specialized, the obscure, and the innovative. The texts that pushed the boundaries of ancient knowledge, the texts that explored new territories and developed new methods, were precisely the texts that were least likely to be widely copied and therefore least likely to survive. The ongoing work of cataloguing and digitizing Byzantine manuscripts has brought new attention to the scattered remains of Constantinople's collections. Major digitization projects, including those at the Vatican Library, the Biblioteca Marciana in Venice, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and the British Library, have made thousands of Byzantine manuscripts available online, enabling scholars around the world to study them without travelling to the physical collections. These projects have led to new discoveries, including the identification of previously unrecognized texts, the correction of long-standing errors in the editions of known texts, and the reconstruction of the provenance and transmission history of individual manuscripts. The digitization of the manuscripts at Mount Athos, undertaken by several international scholarly teams, has been particularly productive. The Athos libraries contain manuscripts that have been examined by very few scholars over the centuries, and the digitization process has revealed texts and readings that were previously unknown to the scholarly community. The discovery of a previously unknown commentary on an ancient philosophical text, or a previously unrecognized copy of a work that was thought to survive in only one or two manuscripts, can significantly alter scholarly understanding of the transmission history and textual accuracy of that work. The potential of digitization extends beyond simple accessibility. Digital imaging technologies can reveal details of manuscripts that are invisible to the naked eye, including erased or faded text, hidden annotations, and physical features of the parchment that provide clues about the manuscript's origin and history. Ultraviolet fluorescence, infrared reflectography, and multispectral imaging can all be applied to digitized manuscripts, enabling scholars to extract information from the physical objects that would be difficult or impossible to obtain through traditional methods of visual inspection. The ongoing work of cataloguing Byzantine manuscripts in collections around the world has also produced significant results. Many of the world's collections of Byzantine manuscripts were catalogued in the 19th or early 20th century, when cataloguing standards were less rigorous than they are today, and when the catalogers sometimes lacked the specialized knowledge needed to identify obscure or unusual texts. Modern recataloguing projects, undertaken with better tools and deeper expertise, have occasionally identified texts that were miscatalogued or overlooked by earlier scholars. A manuscript that was catalogued simply as miscellaneous Greek texts by a 19th century librarian who could not read the hand might, on closer inspection by a modern specialist, turn out to contain a previously unrecognized copy of a significant ancient work or a Byzantine commentary that preserves quotations from a lost text. These discoveries are exciting, but they are also humbling. Each one reminds us that the surviving manuscript corpus has not yet been fully explored, that there are still treasures waiting to be discovered in the collections that already exist. But it also reminds us that the discoveries, however welcome, cannot compensate for the vastly larger body of material that has been permanently destroyed. The few texts that are newly discovered in existing collections are drops in an ocean of loss. There is one final angle of recovery that deserves mention: the reconstruction of lost texts through the systematic study of their influence on surviving texts. When a lost work was widely read in antiquity or in the Byzantine period, its ideas, arguments, and phraseology often influenced the works of later writers who had access to it. By carefully analyzing the surviving works for traces of this influence, scholars can sometimes reconstruct aspects of the lost work, its arguments, its style, its vocabulary, and its intellectual orientation, even without direct quotations. This method of indirect tradition recovery is necessarily speculative and uncertain, but it can provide valuable information about lost works that left no direct traces in the form of quotations or summaries. The cumulative effect of all these methods of recovery, archaeological, papyrological, palimpsestic, Arabic, computational, and textual, has been to expand our knowledge of the ancient world incrementally but significantly over the past 2 centuries. We know more about ancient Greek literature, science, philosophy, and culture today than scholars knew 100 years ago, and we will know more 100 years from now than we know today. The process of recovery is ongoing, and it will continue for as long as scholars persist in the patient, meticulous work of excavating the scattered remains of the ancient literary tradition. Yet the process of recovery also deepens the awareness of loss. Every new fragment that is discovered, every new palimpsest that is read, every new papyrus that is published, reveals not only the text it contains, but also, by implication, the vast body of texts that it does not contain, the fragments and windows, and what they show us, beyond their own contents, is the scale of the darkness that surrounds them. Each recovery makes the surviving canon of ancient Greek literature a little richer and a little more diverse, but each recovery also makes the void a little more visible, a little more measurable, a little more impossible to ignore. The fragments illuminate the darkness that surrounds them, and the more light we cast, the more we understand the magnitude of what remains forever hidden from view. But digitization, like every other tool of recovery, has its limitations. It can make existing manuscripts more accessible, but it cannot recreate manuscripts that no longer exist. It can facilitate the study of what has survived, but it cannot restore what has been lost. It can reveal previously hidden and long-forgotten texts beneath overwritten pages, but it cannot reconstruct manuscripts that were burned to ash or ground to dust. The void at the center of the story, the hundreds of thousands of manuscripts that were destroyed in the fires, the sacks, and the centuries of neglect, remains unfilled and unfeelable. Every new technology that we develop for the study of surviving manuscripts brings us closer to a complete understanding of what we have, but it also brings us closer to a complete understanding of what we have lost. And the second realization is, if anything, more sobering than the first. Everything we have discussed so far concerns the loss of specific texts, specific manuscripts, specific categories of knowledge. These losses are real and painful, and they can be partially documented through the painstaking work of codicologists, paleographers, and textual critics. But beneath these specific losses lies a deeper truth, a truth that concerns the very structure of our relationship to the ancient world, and the way that relationship has been shaped by the accidents of Byzantine survival. The deeper truth is this: the ancient world that we know, the classical Greece that we study in universities and celebrate in our culture, is not the actual ancient world. It is a Byzantine construction, a selection from a much larger body of knowledge that was filtered through 1,000 years of copying, editing, condensing, and selective preservation in the libraries of Constantinople. The Greece that we inherit is the Greece that the Byzantines chose to preserve. The Greece that we have lost is the Greece that the Byzantines failed to preserve, whether through deliberate neglect, accidental destruction, or the simple economics of manuscript production. This is not science fiction. This is the logical and well-documented consequence of the transmission process that we have been tracing throughout this story. Every text that we read from the ancient world has passed through Byzantine hands. The manuscripts from which our modern editions are derived were, in the overwhelming majority of cases, produced in Byzantine scriptoria, stored in Byzantine libraries, and transmitted to the modern world through Byzantine channels. The Byzantines were the intermediaries between us and the ancient Greeks, and like all intermediaries, they shaped what they transmitted. They selected certain texts for copying and neglected others. They edited the texts they copied, sometimes correcting errors and sometimes introducing new ones. They organized their collections according to their own priorities, which meant that texts that served Byzantine educational and religious needs were preserved at higher rates than texts that did not. The result is that our image of ancient Greece is systematically distorted. We see a civilization that was dominated by a relatively small number of canonical authors: Homer, Plato, Aristotle, the three tragedians, the major historians, and a handful of scientists and mathematicians, because these are the authors whose works the Byzantines preserved most completely. We do not see the vast majority of ancient Greek writers, the minor poets, the obscure philosophers, the provincial historians, the technical specialists, the anonymous craftsmen, who recorded their techniques in written form, because their works were not copied with sufficient frequency to survive the bottlenecks of the Byzantine transmission process. This distortion has real consequences for our understanding of the ancient world. It makes ancient Greece appear more unified, more coherent, and more focused on a small number of great achievements than it actually was. It makes the ancient Greeks appear more interested in philosophy, literature, and abstract thought than in practical technology, applied science, and daily life, because the texts that documented these practical activities were the texts most likely to be neglected by the Byzantine copying tradition. It creates the illusion that the ancient world was a world of great thinkers and great books, when in reality it was a world of millions of people living complex lives, only a tiny fraction of which were documented in the texts that the Byzantines chose to preserve. The distortion also affects our understanding of the diversity of ancient thought. The philosophical traditions that survive from the ancient world, primarily the Platonic, Aristotelian, Stoic, and Epicurean traditions, are the traditions that the Byzantines valued and preserved. But there were many other philosophical traditions in antiquity, schools of thought that attracted followers, produced written works, and contributed to the intellectual life of their communities, that are now known only through fragments and second-hand references. The Cynics, the Cyrenaics, the Megarians, the skeptics of various kinds, the Neo-Pythagoreans, and dozens of lesser-known schools and independent thinkers produced a body of philosophical literature that was available in Constantinople's libraries for centuries, but that was not copied with sufficient frequency to survive the successive catastrophes that struck those libraries. The same pattern applies to ancient Greek literary genres that have been almost entirely lost. Ancient Greek prose fiction, the novels and romances that were popular entertainment for educated readers in the Hellenistic and Roman periods, survives in only a handful of examples. The works of Chariton, Xenophon of Ephesus, Longus, Achilles Tatius, and Heliodorus. Photius, in his Bibliotheca, describes several additional novels that are now lost, including works by Antonius Diogenes Iamblichus and others whose plots, characters, and literary qualities he describes in sufficient detail to make their loss particularly frustrating. The surviving novels are among the most entertaining and accessible of ancient literary works, and they suggest that the lost novels, which may have numbered in the dozens or hundreds, would significantly expand our understanding of ancient popular literature if they could be recovered. Ancient Greek travel writing, geographical description, and ethnographic literature is another genre that has suffered catastrophic losses. The works of Pausanias, who wrote a detailed description of Greece in the 2nd century of the Common Era, survive and are invaluable for our knowledge of ancient Greek art, architecture, and religious practice. But Pausanias was not the only ancient travel writer. Dozens of other authors produced similar descriptions of other regions of the ancient world, descriptions that documented the peoples, customs, monuments, and natural features of lands stretching from India to Britain. These works are almost entirely lost, and with them, our ability to reconstruct the physical and cultural geography of the ancient world in anything approaching its full richness and detail. Let that sink in. The Imperial Library of Constantinople was the lens through which we see the ancient world, and like all lenses, it distorted what it transmitted, magnifying certain features and diminishing others. The features it magnified, the canonical texts, the great authors, the works of enduring literary and philosophical significance, are the features that dominate our image of ancient Greece. The features it diminished, the minor works, the practical texts, the voices of the obscure and the marginal, are the features that are missing from our image, creating gaps and blind spots that we often fail to recognize because we have no way of seeing what is not there. Consider one specific example of how this distortion operates. Ancient Greek music was an integral part of Greek culture. Music accompanied religious rituals, theatrical performances, athletic competitions, and social gatherings. The Greeks developed sophisticated theories of musical harmony, rhythm, and modes that influenced Western music theory for over 2,000 years. They produced a body of musical literature, including treatises on musical theory, compositions, and practical handbooks, that was substantial and influential. Almost none of it survives. We have a handful of theoretical treatises by Aristoxenus, Ptolemy, and a few others that describe the principles of Greek musical theory. We have a tiny number of actual musical compositions inscribed on stone or preserved on papyrus fragments that give us some idea of what Greek music actually sounded like. But the vast body of Greek musical literature, the compositions, the performance manuals, the descriptions of instruments and techniques, the records of specific performances and the reactions they provoked, all of this is lost. The Byzantine transmission process preserved the theoretical treatises which were of interest to scholars and which could be integrated into the Byzantine educational curriculum. It did not preserve the practical musical literature which required specialized knowledge to interpret and which did not serve the educational needs of the Byzantine system. Something is wrong with our assumptions about the completeness of our knowledge. We study ancient Greek music theory from a handful of theoretical texts, and we imagine that we understand ancient Greek music. We do not. We understand the theory, or at least the portions of the theory, that the Byzantines chose to preserve. The practice, the living reality of Greek music as it was actually performed and experienced, is almost entirely beyond our reach. And this gap between theory and practice, between the preserved and the lost, is not unique to music. It applies to every aspect of ancient Greek culture that had a significant practical component. Agriculture, engineering, navigation, textile production, metallurgy, ceramics, architecture, cooking, perfumery, and dozens of other crafts and technologies that were documented in written texts that did not survive the Byzantine filtering process. The deeper truth about the Imperial Library of Constantinople is that it did not merely preserve knowledge, it defined knowledge. It determined, through the cumulative effect of 1,000 years of copying decisions, what the modern world would know and what it would not know about the civilization that produced the Western intellectual tradition. The library's influence on our understanding of the ancient world is not passive, it is active, shaping, and inescapable. We cannot see the ancient world except through the lens that Constantinople provided, and we cannot correct the distortions of that lens because the evidence needed for correction is the very evidence that was lost. Let that sink in. Every course on ancient Greek civilization, every textbook, every documentary, every popular account of the glories of classical Greece is built on a foundation of Byzantine choices. The canonical authors that we celebrate, the philosophical traditions that we trace, the scientific achievements that we admire, the literary forms that we study, all of these are the products of a filtering process that operated in Constantinople over 1,000 years. And that produced a sample of the original that is both magnificent and deeply incomplete. There is a concept in information theory called lossy compression. It describes a method of reducing the size of a data file by permanently discarding some of the information it contains. A compressed image file, for example, may look very similar to the original at a glance, but close inspection reveals that fine details have been lost, subtle gradations have been flattened, and the overall quality has been reduced. The compression is useful because it produces a smaller file that is easier to store and transmit, but it is also destructive because the discarded information can never be recovered. The Byzantine transmission of ancient Greek knowledge was a process of lossy compression sustained over a millennium. The original file, the complete literary and intellectual output of ancient Greek civilization, was enormous. The Krumsems file that the Byzantines transmitted to the modern world, the surviving corpus of ancient Greek texts, is much smaller. At a glance, it looks like a complete picture. It contains the major works, the canonical authors, the foundational texts of Western civilization. But close inspection reveals that fine details have been lost. Entire genres have been reduced to fragments. Major authors are represented by only a fraction of their output. Minor authors have disappeared entirely. The compressed file is beautiful and valuable, but it is not the original, and the difference between the two, the information that was permanently discarded during a millennium of lossy compression, is staggering. The progressive catastrophes that struck the Imperial Library, the fires, the sack of 1204, the Ottoman conquest of 1453, accelerated this compression process by destroying large portions of the collection at each stage. Each catastrophe acted as an additional round of compression, permanently removing additional information from the file. The final result, the surviving corpus of ancient Greek texts that we possess today, is a file that has been compressed multiple times, each compression more aggressive than the last, each removing additional detail, additional nuance, additional content that can never be recovered. The implications for modern scholarship are profound. Every conclusion that we draw about the ancient world is implicitly qualified by the phrase, based on the surviving evidence. And the surviving evidence, as we have now seen in detail, is a heavily compressed, systematically biased, and deeply incomplete sample of what was actually produced. Our generalizations about ancient Greek culture, our theories about the development of Greek thought, our narratives about the history of ancient science and philosophy, all of these are provisional constructions built on foundations that are far more fragile and far more partial than most people realize. There is a concept in environmental science called shifting baseline syndrome. It describes the phenomenon whereby each generation of scientists accepts the environmental conditions they observe at the start of their careers as the baseline for normal, failing to recognize how much the environment has already been degraded by previous generations. A fisheries scientist who begins studying a particular fishing ground in the 1980s may accept the fish populations of that period as normal, unaware that the populations were already a fraction of what they had been in the 1950s, which were in turn a fraction of what they had been in the 1920s. Each generation resets the baseline, and the cumulative decline becomes invisible. A similar phenomenon operates in classical scholarship. Each generation of scholars accepts the surviving textual canon as the baseline for understanding the ancient world, without fully grasping how much has been lost. We study Plato and Aristotle and Homer and the three tragedians, and treat them as the complete picture of ancient intellectual life, when in fact they are the survivors of a catastrophe that destroyed roughly 95% or more of what was actually produced. We reset the baseline with each new generation of students, and the magnitude of the loss recedes from view. The shifting baseline has erased not only specific texts, but entire fields of ancient knowledge from the collective memory. How many modern students of ancient Greece know that the Greeks had a rich tradition of prose fiction, of novels and romances that was popular across the Mediterranean for centuries? How many know that the Greeks produced a vast body of technical literature on agriculture, metallurgy, engineering, and other practical arts? How many know that the Hellenistic period, the 3 centuries following Alexander the Great, was arguably the most productive period in the history of ancient Greek intellectual life, producing more scientific, philosophical, and literary works than the classical period that preceded it? These facts are not obscure. They are well documented in the surviving sources, but they are not part of the standard image of ancient Greece that is transmitted through modern education, because the texts that would have made them vivid and immediate have been lost. The digital age has created new forms of vulnerability that parallel, in unsettling ways, the vulnerabilities that destroyed Constantinople's libraries. We produce more text, more data, more information in a single day than the entire ancient world produced in a century. But the digital media on which we store this information are, in many respects, more fragile than the parchment manuscripts that carried the knowledge of the ancient world through the medieval centuries. A parchment manuscript that is stored in reasonable conditions can last for over 1,000 years. A hard drive has an expected lifespan of 3 to 5 years. A solid-state drive may last somewhat longer, but the data it contains will degrade over decades without active maintenance. Cloud storage depends on the continued existence and continued willingness of the storage provider to maintain the service. This is not science fiction. It is happening now. Academic institutions have lost research data when storage contracts expired. Government agencies have lost records when systems were decommissioned without adequate data migration. Individuals have lost irreplaceable personal documents when cloud services were discontinued. The technology companies that maintain the largest digital archives in history operate on business models that prioritize growth and profit over long-term preservation, and their archives are subject to the same forces of market disruption, regulatory change, and institutional failure that have destroyed every previous system of knowledge storage in human history. The library's destruction also had consequences for the self-understanding of subsequent civilizations. The Renaissance, which was fueled in large part by the recovery of Greek texts from Byzantine sources, constructed an image of ancient Greece that was based on the texts that had survived the Byzantine transmission. This image, in turn, became the foundation for the Western conception of classical antiquity, a conception that has shaped education, art, philosophy, science, and politics for over 5 centuries. The ancient Greece that we celebrate as the cradle of Western civilization is, in significant part, a creation of the Renaissance, which was itself a product of the Byzantine transmission, which was itself a filtered and compressed version of the actual ancient world. Each layer of mediation introduces additional distortion, and the cumulative effect is an image of the ancient world that is both inspiring and misleading. The consequences of this distortion are not merely academic. They have shaped the way Western civilization understands itself, its origins, and its relationship to other cultures. The image of ancient Greece as a civilization of philosophers, dramatists, and abstract thinkers, a civilization that valued reason, beauty, and truth above all else, has served as a model and an aspiration for Western cultures from the Renaissance to the present day. But this image is based on the surviving texts, which overrepresent philosophy, literature, and abstract thought relative to practical technology, applied science, and everyday life. The actual ancient Greek civilization was far more diverse, far more practical, and far more connected to the material realities of daily existence than the surviving texts suggest. The Greeks were not just philosophers and poets. They were also engineers, farmers, merchants, sailors, soldiers, and artisans. And the texts that documented these practical activities have been disproportionately lost. The distortion has also affected the way the West understands its relationship to other civilizations. The image of ancient Greece as uniquely rational, uniquely philosophical, uniquely committed to the life of the mind has sometimes been used to construct a narrative of Western exceptionalism, a narrative in which the West is distinguished from other civilizations by its Greek heritage of reason and inquiry. But this narrative is based on a selective reading of the surviving evidence, a reading that emphasizes the philosophical and intellectual achievements of the Greeks, while ignoring or minimizing the practical, technological, and commercial dimensions of their civilization that are less well documented in the surviving texts. A fuller picture of the ancient world, based on the complete literary output of the Greek civilization, rather than the filtered sample that survived the Byzantine transmission, might produce a very different narrative, one in which the Greeks appear less exceptional and more connected to the broader currents of human civilization that flowed across the ancient Mediterranean and beyond. Modern debates about the canon of Western literature, about which authors should be read and studied, and which should be set aside, are conducted within a framework that is itself a product of catastrophic loss. When scholars argue about whether the traditional canon of ancient Greek literature is too narrow or too focused on a small number of elite authors, they are arguing about a selection that was already radically narrowed by the destruction of the ancient and Byzantine libraries. The traditional canon is not the product of deliberate selection from a full range of available works. It is the product of survival, shaped by the same forces of fire, flood, war, and neglect that destroyed the Imperial Library of Constantinople. The debate about what should be included in the canon is, in a very real sense, a debate about which survivors we choose to honor, conducted in ignorance of the vast majority of candidates who did not survive to be considered. The Byzantines themselves were aware, to some degree, of the losses they were witnessing. The scholars of the Paleologan period, working in a shrinking empire with dwindling resources, knew that texts were being lost. They could see the gaps in the library's shelves. They could note the titles mentioned by earlier scholars that were no longer available. They made lists of lost works, compiled bibliographies of texts they could no longer find, and wrote wistfully about the riches of earlier periods. Their awareness of the loss gives their scholarly work a poignant quality. They were trying to preserve what they could, knowing that the tide of destruction was rising, and that their efforts, however heroic, could not stem it. The late Byzantine scholar Manuel Chrysoloras, when he travelled to Italy in 1397 to teach Greek to Italian humanists, carried with him not only manuscripts but also an acute awareness of the fragility of the tradition he represented. He knew that the Greek learning he was transmitting to his Italian students might not survive in its home territory for much longer. The Ottoman Turks had already conquered most of the Byzantine Empire's former territories. Constantinople itself was under increasing pressure, its population dwindling, its economy declining, its military capacity diminishing with each passing decade. Chrysoloras' mission to Italy was, in a sense, an act of intellectual evacuation, an attempt to transplant the roots of Greek learning in Western soil before the Eastern soil was overwhelmed. Other late Byzantine scholars undertook similar missions with similar motivations. George Gemistos Plethen's influence on the Italian humanists, particularly Cosimo de' Medici, helped to inspire the founding of the Platonic Academy in Florence, which became one of the most important centres of Neoplatonic philosophy in the Renaissance. John Argyropoulos taught Greek in Florence and Rome, training a generation of Italian scholars who would carry forward the work of translating and interpreting Greek texts. Demetrius Chalcondyles held chairs of Greek at the universities of Padua and Florence, and produced the first printed edition of Homer in 1488. These scholars were not merely transmitting texts, they were transmitting an entire intellectual tradition, a way of reading, interpreting, and engaging with the classical past that had been developed and refined over 1,000 years of Byzantine scholarship. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was not the end of Byzantine scholarly tradition. It was the end of the institutional framework that had supported that tradition, the end of the city that had served as the focal point of Greek learning for over 1,000 years. But the tradition itself survived in the Greek communities of the diaspora, in the scholars who emigrated to Italy and other Western European countries, in the monasteries that continued to function under Ottoman rule, and in the manuscripts that found new homes in libraries across Europe. The tradition was diminished, fragmented, and deprived of its institutional centre, but it was not extinct. The thread, though frayed, was not entirely broken. If we had the full output of the ancient world, the complete literary production of the Greek civilization, our understanding of that civilization would be fundamentally different. We would see a far more diverse range of voices, perspectives, and intellectual traditions. We would have access to the works of writers who are now completely unknown, whose names have been lost along with their texts. We would see the canonical figures, in a richer context, surrounded by the broader intellectual community that nurtured them and challenged them and built upon their work. We would have access to the practical and technical literature that documented how the ancient Greeks actually built their buildings, sailed their ships, farmed their land, healed their sick, and organized their communities. We would, in short, have a far more complete and far more accurate picture of one of the most formative civilizations in human history. Instead, we have fragments. We have the survivors of a shipwreck, clinging to the wreckage, telling us about the ship that sank. Their testimony is valuable, but it is incomplete. It cannot tell us about the passengers who went down with the ship, the cargo that was lost, the route that was never completed. The Imperial Library of Constantinople was the ship. Its cargo was the complete intellectual heritage of the Greek-speaking world, and the wreck scattered that cargo across the floor of history, leaving us to collect what pieces we can find and to construct from them an image of the whole that is necessarily partial, necessarily distorted, and necessarily haunted by the awareness of what we cannot see. The question that the deeper truth poses to modern scholarship is whether it is possible to correct, even partially, the distortions introduced by the Byzantine transmission. Can we, using the tools and techniques available to us, recover some of the information that was lost? Can we reconstruct, even approximately, the fuller picture of the ancient world that existed before the Byzantine filtering process reduced it to the compressed sample we now possess? The answer is a qualified yes. Papyrological discoveries, palimpsest recoveries, Arabic translations, and the computational analysis of fragments and quotations all contribute to a gradual expansion of our knowledge of the ancient world. Each new discovery adds a small piece to the puzzle, filling in a tiny portion of the vast blank space that surrounds the surviving texts. The process is slow, painstaking, and incremental, but it is real and it is ongoing. The computational analysis of fragments and quotations is a particularly promising avenue of modern recovery. By using digital databases to systematically identify, collect, and organize every surviving quotation from a lost work, scattered across hundreds of surviving texts, scholars can build partial reconstructions that reveal the structure, the arguments, and sometimes even the exact wording of the original. This work has been greatly facilitated by the digitization of ancient and medieval texts, which allows scholars to search vast corpora of literature for references to lost works with a speed and thoroughness that would have been impossible with manual methods. The digital tools do not replace traditional philological expertise, but they amplify it enormously, making it possible for a single scholar to accomplish in months what might have taken a previous generation of scholars decades. The recovery of lost ancient texts through new papyrus discoveries also continues, though at a slower pace than in the golden age of papyrology in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The dry climate of Egypt continues to yield new finds, and the re-examination of previously published papyri with improved reading techniques and better photographic technology, sometimes reveals new texts or new readings that had been missed by earlier editors. The ongoing publication of the Oxyrhynchus papyri, a process that has been underway for over a century and is still far from complete, continues to add new fragments of lost works to the scholarly record. But the qualified yes must be balanced against a recognition of the limits of recovery. The vast majority of what was lost in Constantinople's libraries is permanently and irretrievably gone. No technology, no discovery, no amount of scholarly effort can bring back the manuscripts that were burned, discarded, scrapped for their parchment, or simply allowed to decay. The void at the center of the story is real, and it will forever remain real. We can nibble at its edges, but we cannot fill it. What does the story of the Imperial Library of Constantinople mean for our understanding of ourselves and our place in the long history of human knowledge? The first and most sobering implication is that civilization is more fragile than we like to believe. The Byzantine Empire was one of the most enduring states in human history. It lasted for over 1,000 years, from the founding of Constantinople in 330 to its fall in 1453. It survived invasions, plagues, civil wars, economic crises, and religious controversies that would have destroyed a less resilient state. Its library system was one of the most sophisticated in the world, maintained by trained professionals, supported by imperial funding, and embedded in an educational and cultural framework that valued classical learning as a core component of civilized life. If any institution in human history should have been able to preserve the knowledge entrusted to its care, it was the Imperial Library of Constantinople, and it failed, not because the Byzantines were careless, or incompetent, or indifferent to learning. They were none of these things. They were, by the standards of their age, extraordinarily dedicated to the preservation of knowledge. They failed because the forces that destroy knowledge, fire, war, religious conflict, political upheaval, economic decline, and the simple entropy of organic materials, are relentless and cumulative, and because no human institution, however well designed and however well supported, can withstand those forces indefinitely. This is a lesson that the modern world has not fully absorbed. We tend to assume that our own institutions of knowledge preservation, our universities, our libraries, our archives, our digital storage systems, are permanent. We assume that the knowledge we have accumulated is safe, that it will endure, that the accumulated wisdom of our civilization is somehow self-sustaining. The story of Constantinople teaches us that this assumption is wrong. Knowledge is not self-sustaining. It requires active, continuous, sustained human effort to preserve. And that effort can fail, even when it is carried out by dedicated professionals over the course of 1,000 years. There is a pause worth taking here, a moment of philosophical reflection. Think about the scribes of Constantinople. Think about the men and women who sat in the scriptura of the Imperial Library, the Patriarchal Library, the monastic libraries, day after day, year after year, century after century, copying the texts of the ancient world letter by letter, line by line, page by page. Think about the physical labor involved in this work, the cramped fingers, the aching backs, the straining eyes. Think about the intellectual discipline required to copy a text accurately, to resist the temptation to correct apparent errors, to preserve the exact wording of an original, even when the meaning was unclear. Think about the institutional continuity required to sustain this work across generations, the training of new scribes, the maintenance of scriptoria, the procurement of parchment and ink, the cataloguing and storage of completed manuscripts. This was a civilizational commitment of the highest order, sustained for over 1,000 years, and it preserved a significant portion of the intellectual heritage of the ancient world. But it did not preserve all of it, and the portion that was lost, the texts that were not copied with sufficient frequency, the manuscripts that were consumed by fire or destroyed by invaders, or recycled for their parchment, represents a permanent diminishment of the human intellectual heritage. Those lost texts contained ideas, insights, discoveries, and perspectives that can never be recovered. They represented the labor of thousands of individual human minds, each of whom contributed something unique to the collective project of understanding the world. Their loss is not merely an academic inconvenience. It is a wound in the fabric of human knowledge that cannot be healed. The second implication of the Constantinople story is that the relationship between religion and knowledge is more complex than simple narratives suggest. The Byzantine Empire was a profoundly Christian state, and the preservation of knowledge in Constantinople was carried out within a Christian cultural framework. The same church that sometimes restricted or censored philosophical and scientific texts also maintained the monasteries and patriarchal libraries that preserved thousands of those texts. The same theological concerns that led to the occasional suppression of pagan philosophical works also provided the intellectual motivation for the study and commentary of classical texts, since Byzantine theologians frequently drew on classical philosophy to develop and defend Christian doctrine. The monastic libraries of the Byzantine world, from Constantinople to Mount Athos to the monasteries of Cappadocia and the Sinai, were the backbone of the preservation system. Monks who devoted their lives to prayer and contemplation also devoted significant portions of their time to the copying of manuscripts, both religious and secular. The great monastic scriptoria produced thousands of manuscripts over the centuries, and many of the most important surviving copies of classical texts were produced in monastic settings. The relationship between Christianity and classical learning in Byzantium was not one of simple opposition or simple embrace. It was a complex, evolving, and sometimes contradictory relationship in which the same institution that occasionally burned books also spent centuries carefully copying them. The iconoclast controversy, which may have resulted in the destruction of portions of the Imperial library, was a theological dispute, but it was also, in its broader effects, a dispute about the relationship between visual and textual culture, between the power of images and the power of words. The iconoclast emperors who ordered the destruction of religious images were not opposed to learning per se. They were opposed to a specific form of religious expression that they considered idolatrous. The damage to the library, if it occurred as some sources claim, was collateral rather than deliberate, a byproduct of a religious conflict rather than a targeted assault on knowledge. The Fourth Crusade, by contrast, was a direct assault on Constantinople by fellow Christians, motivated by commercial greed, political ambition, and the casual contempt that the Western Crusaders felt for the Eastern Orthodox Christians of Byzantium. The destruction of manuscripts during the sack of 1204 was not a consequence of religious policy. It was a consequence of cultural barbarism, of soldiers who could not read Greek and did not care about the contents of the books they were destroying. The greatest single blow to Byzantine intellectual culture was delivered not by Muslims or pagans, but by Latin Christians, a fact that the Byzantines never forgot and that continues to complicate the relationship between the Eastern and Western Christian traditions to this day. This is a sobering and uncomfortable lesson for any civilization that divides the world neatly into defenders and enemies of knowledge. The categories are not nearly as clean or as simple as we would like them to be. The defenders and the enemies can be the same people, at different moments under different circumstances, driven by different motivations. The same Christian civilization that preserved the works of Aristotle and Plato in its monastic libraries also, through the catastrophe of the Fourth Crusade, inflicted the most devastating single blow against the greatest repository of classical knowledge in the world. The third implication is that the preservation of knowledge is not spectator sport. It requires active participation, sustained investment, and political commitment. The Byzantine emperors who funded the scriptoria, the patriarchs who maintained the church libraries, the monks who copied manuscripts in remote monasteries, the private collectors who assembled personal libraries, the scholars who compiled encyclopedias and epitomes, all of these individuals and institutions played essential roles in the preservation process. Their efforts were not always coordinated, not always efficient, and not always successful, but without them, the loss would have been far more complete. In our own age, the preservation of knowledge faces new challenges that require new forms of commitment. The transition from print to digital media has created a situation analogous, in some respects, to the ancient transitions from scroll to codex and from majuscule to minuscule script. Information that is not migrated from older formats to newer ones is at risk of becoming inaccessible. Books that are not digitized may become effectively invisible in a world where scholarship is increasingly conducted online. Digital files that are not backed up, refreshed, and maintained may become unreadable as hardware and software platforms evolve and older formats are abandoned. The scale of the modern preservation challenge is staggering. The total volume of digital data produced by human civilization is growing exponentially, roughly doubling every 2 years. The vast majority of this data, the emails, the social media posts, the corporate databases, the scientific datasets, the government records, the personal photographs and videos, is stored on media that will degrade within decades if not actively maintained. The institutions responsible for long-term preservation, national libraries, archives, universities, and a small number of dedicated preservation organizations, lack the resources to preserve more than a tiny fraction of this output. We are producing knowledge and the records of our civilization at a rate that vastly exceeds our capacity to preserve them, and the gap between production and preservation is widening with each passing year. The lesson of Constantinople is that preservation is never complete and never final. It is a continuous process that requires constant attention, constant investment, and constant renewal. The manuscripts that were copied in the 9th century needed to be recopied in the 12th century, and again in the 15th century, and again in printed form in the 16th century. Each stage of copying was an opportunity for both preservation and loss. Each stage required the commitment of resources, the exercise of judgment, and the willingness of human beings to invest their labor in the service of future generations who would never know their names. We are the beneficiaries of that labor. We read Homer, Plato, Aristotle, and Euclid because Byzantine scribes devoted their lives to copying those texts. We study ancient Greek history, philosophy, science, and literature because the Imperial Library of Constantinople and its associated institutions preserved the manuscripts that made that study possible. We are, in the most literal sense, the intellectual heirs of Byzantium, and the knowledge we possess is the legacy of a civilization that most people in the modern West have been taught to ignore or dismiss. The recognition of this debt is itself a form of preservation. To remember what the Byzantines did, to honor their achievement, to understand the scale and the significance of their contribution to the survival of classical knowledge, is to ensure that their story, at least, is not lost. The Byzantines have been the invisible intermediaries of Western civilization for too long. They transmitted the knowledge that made the modern West possible, and they have received almost no credit for it. In popular culture, the word Byzantine is used as a synonym for complexity, obscurity, and bureaucratic opacity. It should be used as a synonym for dedication, perseverance, and the quiet heroism of people who devoted their lives to preserving the knowledge of others. The story of the Imperial Library of Constantinople is ultimately a story about what human beings owe to one another across time. The ancient Greeks wrote for their contemporaries, but their words reached us because the Byzantines chose to preserve them. The Byzantines copied for their own purposes, but their copies reached us because Renaissance scholars chose to seek them out. Each generation in the chain of transmission acted for its own reasons, but the cumulative effect of their actions was the creation of a shared human inheritance that belongs to all of us. That inheritance is incomplete. It has been damaged by fire, by war, by neglect, and by the slow erosion of time, but it exists. And its existence is a testament to the enduring human conviction that knowledge is worth preserving, that the thoughts of the dead can illuminate the lives of the living, and that the conversation between the past and the present is worth sustaining at any cost. The walls of Constantinople still stand, scarred and ancient but unbroken in their outline. The Dosian walls, built in the 5th century and strengthened over the following millennium, run for 6.5 kilometers across the peninsula on which the old city sits, from the Sea of Marmara in the south to the Golden Horn in the north. They are crumbling now, their battlements broken, their towers hollowed out, their gates bricked up or widened for modern traffic. But they stand, and they remember. Walk through the old city today, the city that is now Istanbul, and you walk through layers of history so thick that the ground itself seems saturated with the past. The Hagia Sophia, built by the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, still rises above the skyline, its massive dome a monument to the engineering genius and the spiritual ambition of a civilization that believed it was building for eternity. The Hippodrome, where emperors watched chariot races and the populace gathered for public spectacles, survives in the outline of the modern Sultanahmet Square. The cisterns, the vast underground reservoirs that stored the city's water supply, still hold their columns in darkness, their surfaces reflecting the dim light of modern spotlights installed for tourists. The Chora Church, where Theodore Metachites lavished his patronage on mosaics and frescoes of extraordinary beauty, still stands in the western part of the old city, its walls glowing with images that have survived 7 centuries of political and religious upheaval. But the libraries are gone. The buildings that once held the accumulated knowledge of the Greek-speaking world, the texts of Homer and Plato and Aristotle and Euclid and Ptolemy and Galen and hundreds of other authors, the manuscripts that were copied by generations of scribes and studied by generations of scholars, the physical objects that embodied the intellectual labor of an entire civilization, these are gone. The buildings have been destroyed or repurposed. The shelves have been emptied. The manuscripts have been scattered across the libraries of Europe and the Middle East, or they have been destroyed, and no one living can say which fate befell which text. The silence of a lost library is unlike any other silence. It is not the silence of an empty room. It is the silence of an interrupted conversation, a conversation that was conducted across centuries between the minds of the ancient world and the minds that came after. The scribes of Constantinople were the intermediaries in that conversation. They listened to the ancient voices, transcribed their words, and passed them on. When the conversation was interrupted, by fire, by war, by the fall of the city, the voices that had not yet been passed on were silenced forever. We live in the echo of that conversation. The texts that survived, the fragments of the ancient world that reached us through the Byzantine Channel, have shaped the foundations of modern Western civilization. Our philosophy, our science, our mathematics, our literature, our political theory, our legal traditions, all of these bear the imprint of the ancient Greek texts that the Imperial Library of Constantinople preserved. We are built on Byzantine foundations, and the cracks in those foundations, the gaps where texts were lost and knowledge was destroyed, are cracks in the intellectual architecture of the modern world. The story of the Imperial Library is not a story about the past. It is a story about the present. It is a story about the knowledge we possess and the knowledge we lack, about the texture of understanding that we have inherited and the vast blank spaces that surround it. It is a story about the choices that determine what survives and what is lost, choices made by emperors and scribes and soldiers and monks, by individuals who could not have known the consequences of their decisions, and whose choices nevertheless shaped the intellectual landscape of every century that followed. And it is a story about the responsibility that each generation bears to the generations that follow, the responsibility to preserve, to protect, and to transmit the accumulated wisdom of the species. We do not often think about this responsibility. We take it for granted that the books on our shelves will still be there tomorrow, that the knowledge in our libraries will persist, that the digital files on our servers will remain accessible. We assume a continuity of preservation that the history of Constantinople should teach us never to take for granted. Every library that has ever been built has eventually been destroyed, diminished, or abandoned. Every institution that has ever been established for the preservation of knowledge has eventually faced the forces that erode all institutions: political change, economic decline, natural disaster, human indifference. The question is not whether these forces will come. They always come. The question is whether the preservation systems we build will be strong enough, diverse enough, and resilient enough to weather them. The Byzantine scribes understood this responsibility. They devoted their lives to it. They sat in cold scriptoria by candlelight, copying texts that had been written 1,000 years before their time, preserving the thoughts of men and women who had been dead for centuries, for the benefit of readers who had not yet been born. They did not know who those future readers would be. They did not know what those readers would value or what they would need. They simply copied, page by page, line by line, letter by letter, trusting that the preservation of knowledge was a good in itself, a duty that transcended the circumstances of the moment and the interests of the individual. That trust was not misplaced. The texts they preserved have informed, inspired, and challenged every generation since. The Iliad, which a Byzantine scribe copied in the 10th century, is read today in universities on every continent. The Elements of Euclid, which a Byzantine scribe copied in the 9th century, remain the foundation of mathematical education. The Dialogues of Plato, which Byzantine scribes copied again and again over 1,000 years, continue to shape philosophical inquiry in the 21st century. The work of those scribes, anonymous and unremembered, has borne fruit beyond anything they could have imagined. But the fruits that were never planted, the texts that were not copied, the knowledge that was lost in the fires and the sacks and the slow decay of parchment, these represent the harvest that will never come. The ideas that died in the library's destruction, the insights that were consumed by flame or scattered by soldiers or scraped from parchment to make room for liturgical texts, these are gone. They contributed to the intellectual soil of the ancient world, nourished the minds that produced them, and then were ploughed under, returned to the darkness from which they might have been preserved, had the circumstances been different. Every act of preservation is an act of faith, faith that the future will value what the present has chosen to keep. Every act of destruction, whether deliberate or accidental, is a betrayal of that faith, a closing of a door that can never be reopened. The Imperial Library of Constantinople kept faith for 1,000 years. It held the door open across a millennium of fire, war, plague, and political turmoil. And when the door finally closed on May 29, 1453, the world that lay on the other side of it became, in significant part, inaccessible forever. The walls still stand. The city still breathes. The Bosporus still flows between the continents, just as it did when Constantine built his capital on its shore. But the library is gone. Its manuscripts are scattered or destroyed. Its scribes are dust. And the conversation that it sustained for 1,000 years, the long, slow, patient dialogue between the ancient world and the modern, continues now in a diminished key, carried forward by the fragments that survived, sustained by the memory of what was lost, haunted by the silence of what will never be read again. In the end, what the Imperial Library of Constantinople teaches us is not that knowledge is fragile. We already knew that. What it teaches us is that knowledge is precious precisely because it is fragile, that the value of what we know is inseparable from the ease with which it can be destroyed, that the preservation of knowledge is not a passive act but an active one, requiring the sustained commitment of individuals, institutions, and societies across decades, centuries, and millennia, and that every generation that receives the inheritance of the past bears a sacred obligation to pass it on, enriched if possible, but at the very least intact, to the generations that will follow. The scribes of Constantinople fulfilled that obligation as best they could for 1,000 years. They kept the conversation going. They held the thread. They passed the fire from hand to hand across the centuries, protecting its fragile flame from the winds of history. The question now is whether we will do the same.